She traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, and he rejected her in front of the entire town before she had spoken 10 words. No money, no home, no way back. Just a worn bag, a ruined dress, and a crowd that had already decided what kind of woman she was. But the moment Duncan Aldridge turned his back on her, another man stepped forward. Not out of pity, not out of charity, out of something harder to name and harder to walk away from. What happened next would change everything. For her, for him, and for every rancher in that valley who had been living in fear and calling it survival. If you want to know how far one woman's quiet determination can reach, stay until the end. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and make sure you're following so you don't miss what comes next. The train pulled into Harlan Creek just past 2 in the afternoon, trailing a long plume of black smoke across a sky the color of old tin. Evelyn Mercer pressed her face briefly to the window glass and watched the platform materialize out of the heat haze. A knot of people, a water tower with a crack running up one side, a string of horses tied to a post outside the freight office. She sat back and smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. It was the green wool one, the nicest thing she owned, and it had developed a shine at the elbows somewhere around the Kansas border. She had told herself it wasn't noticeable. She had been telling herself a lot of things for the past 3 weeks. She had been telling herself that Duncan Aldridge's letters were warm because the man himself was warm, not because he had paid someone with better penmanship to write them. She had been telling herself that the photograph he'd sent, a prosperous-looking man in a good coat, square jaw, confident eyes, was recent. She had been telling herself that traveling 2,000 miles to marry a stranger was a sensible decision made by a rational woman, not an act of desperation dressed up in optimism. The train groaned to a stop. Evelyn picked up her bag, straightened her hat, and walked to the end of the car. The platform was louder than she expected. Freight was being unloaded 2 cars back, men calling out to each other in the mid-afternoon heat, chains dragging across wood. A cluster of women near the depot wall had paused their conversation to watch the passengers disembark, the way people in small towns always watched. Not rudely, just openly, the way you watched anything that arrived from somewhere else. Evelyn stepped down and looked for the man from the photograph. She recognized him immediately, even though he looked older than the picture and heavier around the jaw. Duncan Aldridge was standing about 20 feet away, hat in hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that made her stomach drop before he'd said a single word. It wasn't discomfort, it wasn't nerves, it was assessment, the flat, dispassionate look of a man examining something he'd ordered and found inadequate. She walked toward him anyway. She didn't know what else to do. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I'm Evelyn Mercer. We've been corresponding these past 4 months." He looked her over from hat to hem, not quickly, slowly the way a buyer looks at livestock. "I can see that," he said. She waited. He didn't extend his hand. "You're shorter than I pictured," he said finally, "and older." Behind her, she heard the cluster of women go quiet. "I'm 26, Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was told 23. "I don't know who told you that. My letters were accurate." Duncan Aldridge put his hat back on his head. The gesture had a finality to it, the same as a door closing. "Miss Mercer, I run the largest cattle operation in this valley. I entertain territorial officials. I have a certain standing to maintain." He paused. "I needed someone, suitable." The word landed like a flat stone. Around her, the ambient noise of the platform seemed to have quieted. Evelyn didn't look around to confirm it. She kept her eyes on Aldridge. "Are you saying I'm not?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. That was somehow worse than if he had. "I'll pay for your train fare back to wherever you came from," he said. "That's the fair thing to do." "The fair thing," she repeated. "That's what I said." She stood there for a moment on the sun-bleached boards of that platform while the full weight of it settled onto her. Not just the humiliation, which was considerable, but the practical facts beneath it. She had spent nearly everything she had getting here. She knew no one in Harlan Creek or anywhere within 500 miles of it. She had no position waiting for her anywhere, no family with a spare room, no plan beyond the one that had just collapsed in front of an audience. A man somewhere to her left said something low, and another man laughed. One of the women behind her murmured something to her companion. Evelyn caught the word brazen and understood it was aimed at her. The implication being that a woman who had traveled this far to marry a man she'd never met had brought whatever happened to her on herself. She thought she might be sick. She breathed through it. Duncan Aldridge was already half turned away, speaking to someone behind him. A hired man, it looked like. Someone he'd brought along to witness or to drive. He'd dismissed her. Not cruelly exactly, just completely. As though she were already gone. "That's a generous offer you're making, Aldridge." The voice came from the far end of the platform, unhurried and dry. Evelyn turned. The man walking toward them was perhaps 40, lean in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors rather than men who watched what they ate. He had a weathered face and dark eyes, and he moved through the small crowd the way water moves around stones, without effort, without pause. A couple of men shifted out of his path without quite seeming to notice they'd done it. He wore no gun on his hip, which Evelyn registered as either strange or significant. She wasn't sure which. "Wyatt," Duncan Aldridge said. His voice had changed slightly. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I didn't know you were in town. I come in for supplies, same as everybody else." Wyatt stopped a few feet away and looked at Evelyn briefly. Not the way Aldridge had looked at her. Not assessment, more like taking inventory of a situation. Then he looked back at Aldridge. "You brought the woman all the way out here, and now you're sending her back." "That's my business." The whole platform heard it. "Stops being entirely your business at a certain point." Aldridge's face colored. "I don't see how it concerns you." "It doesn't," Wyatt said. "I'm making it concern me." He turned to Evelyn. "You looking for work or just a way out of town?" She looked at him. She had no idea who he was. She knew enough to know that accepting help from an unknown man in a strange town was its own species of risk. She also knew that she had approximately $4.30 in her bag, and the train she'd arrived on was the last one through Harlan Creek until Thursday. "Depends on the work," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing around a working ranch. I've got 4 men in a house nobody's properly cleaned since my last housekeeper left 2 winters ago." He paused. "It's not glamorous. The pay is fair and the work is real." "Where's your ranch?" 8 miles north. Granger Ranch, if that means anything to you." It didn't. But it seemed to mean something to the people listening because she noticed the quality of the quiet around them change. "It's honest work," he added. "That's the only promise I'll make." Evelyn looked at Duncan Aldridge, who was watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. Irritation, maybe, or something uglier underneath it. Then she looked back at Wyatt Granger. "I'll take it," she said. Shab. She regretted it approximately 12 minutes later, sitting in the back of a supply wagon as Harlan Creek shrank behind them, her bag on her knees and the sun beating down on her wool dress, which was becoming less presentable by the minute. She had accepted a job from a man she had spoken to for perhaps 90 seconds in a town she didn't know, to work at a ranch she'd never heard of, because the alternative had been standing on a train platform with no money and nowhere to go. This was not how the last several months of her life were supposed to have gone. She had grown up in Ohio, the second of 4 children, in a house that was never quite warm enough in winter and never quite cool enough in summer. Her father had worked for the railroad and died of a fever when Evelyn was 19, leaving her mother to take in sewing and leaving Evelyn to contribute however she could. She had worked in a dry goods store for 3 years, then as a bookkeeper for a small mill until the mill closed, then as a seamstress until her eyes started giving her trouble in poor light. When her mother died 18 months ago and her older brother sold the house to settle debts, Evelyn had been left with her belongings, a small amount of savings, and the clear understanding that she needed a different kind of plan. The correspondent agency had seemed reasonable enough. She had written her letters carefully and honestly, her age, her situation, her capabilities. She could cook and clean and keep accounts. She was healthy. She was not looking for romance. She was looking for a workable arrangement, and she'd said as much. Duncan Aldridge's responses had seemed to match that. Practical, direct, describing what he needed and what he could offer. She had not expected warmth exactly. She had expected fairness. She looked at the back of Wyatt Granger's head, where he sat up front beside the driver, a young man with red hair who had introduced himself as Colt and hadn't said another word since. Granger hadn't said much either. He'd helped her up onto the wagon with a hand that was calloused and impersonal, the same way you'd help anyone up. And then he'd turned forward, and that had been more or less that. She didn't know what to make of him. She didn't know what to make of any of this. The land unrolled around her, vast and dry and indifferent, and Evelyn Mercer sat in the back of a stranger's wagon, heading somewhere she'd never been, and tried to figure out how to make the best of a situation she had not planned for. Granger Ranch was not what she'd expected, though she realized later she hadn't known what to expect. It was bigger than she'd pictured. A main house of solid construction, weathered but sound, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. Behind it, a large barn, two smaller outbuildings, a bunkhouse set back from the main structures, and a network of corrals and fencing that stretched away toward tree line. There were horses in the near pasture and cattle visible on the hillside beyond. The land itself was good. She could see that even without knowing much about ranching, the way the grass held its color and the creek that ran along the north side of the property still ran, which in summer meant something. The house, though, the house was a different matter. Wyatt led her inside without ceremony, and she got her first look at the interior and understood immediately what "nobody's properly cleaned it in 2 winters" actually meant. It wasn't dirty in the way of genuine neglect. Someone had been making at least minimal effort, but it had the particular disorder of a place maintained only for function, with no thought toward comfort or livability. Dishes were stacked rather than put away. Boots were left wherever they were removed. Curtains that had once been white were now a color best described as former white. The kitchen table had a crack down the middle that had been fixed with a piece of iron and what appeared to be sheer optimism. "I can see you need the help," she said. He looked at her with something that might, in a different man, have been embarrassment. "It gets away from you. I'll need cleaning supplies. What you have is probably insufficient. Make a list. Colt goes into town Thursday." She moved through the kitchen, assessing. The stove was a good one, at least, a substantial iron range that would serve well once it was properly cleaned. The pantry held flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, and little else. A string of dried herbs hung from a nail, more out of memory than use, it looked like. "What do your men eat?" she asked. "Whatever's made." "That's not an answer." A pause. "Beef, beans, biscuits when someone gets around to them. Biscuits require someone to make them." "That's what I'm saying." She turned and looked at him directly. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, watching her take inventory with an expression she still couldn't quite read. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't friendly either. He was simply present, observing, waiting to see what she would do. "I'll need to know where everything is," she said. "The root cellar, the smokehouse, whether you have a garden, and whether anyone's been tending it. I'll want to speak to whoever's been doing the cooking up to now." "That's been Pete, mostly. He won't object to someone taking it over." "I'd imagine not." She looked around the kitchen once more. "And the rest of the house. I'll need access to everything. I'm not going to clean around things." "You have it. Then I'll start today." He straightened from the door frame. She'd expected him to leave, but he didn't, not immediately. He stood there a moment longer, looking at her in that assessing way of his, and she had the distinct impression he was trying to make up his mind about something. "The men will be respectful," he said finally. "If they're not, you tell me. I can manage discourtesy on my own. I don't doubt it. I'm telling you anyway." He paused. "Supper's at 6. Whatever you put together is fine." He left. She heard his boots on the porch, then nothing. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of Granger Ranch and looked at the work in front of her. It was considerable. She tied her sleeves back, found an apron hanging on a peg near the door, and got started. The men came in for supper at 6 the way he'd said they would. 4 of them, dusty and quiet in the way of men who'd been working hard since early morning and didn't have much left for conversation. They filed through the door and stopped almost simultaneously when they registered the state of the table. She had, in the 4 hours available to her, scrubbed the kitchen from floor to ceiling, reorganized the pantry into something resembling order, found a jar of preserved tomatoes in the root cellar that she'd combined with the dried beans and some salt pork into a proper stew, produced a pan of biscuits that were not perfect. She hadn't had time to test the oven's temperament, but were at least recognizable as biscuits, and located a tablecloth in a chest in the back bedroom that was clean enough to use. The men looked at the table, they looked at the stew, they looked at her. "Evening," she said. A moment of silence. Then the one with a heavy mustache, she would learn he was Pete, the de facto cook of the preceding months, pulled off his hat and said, "Evening, ma'am," and sat down. The others followed. Wyatt came in last and sat at the head of the table without comment, though she caught him glancing at the tablecloth briefly before looking away. The stew was eaten without complaint, which she understood was high praise in this context. Pete had thirds. Afterward, the men went out to the bunkhouse, and Wyatt lingered at the table with a cup of coffee, and Evelyn began clearing. She was tired in a way that had gone past the edges of tiredness into something more physical, a low buzzing in her limbs and a heaviness behind her eyes. She had been on a train for 3 weeks, and then humiliated on a platform, and then driven 8 miles through the afternoon heat, and then spent 4 hours cleaning and cooking, and it was catching up to her. "You didn't have to do all of this today," Wyatt said. "The cleaning needed doing." "I meant the tablecloth." She glanced at him. He was looking into his coffee cup rather than at her. "A table is easier to eat at when it's properly set," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you come from, before Ohio?" "Ohio is where I grew up. There wasn't a before." "What did you do there?" "Worked. Bookkeeping mostly, for a while. Then sewing." She stacked plates efficiently. "Is there a reason for the questions?" "Just trying to get a picture of who I've hired. I'm a woman who can cook, clean, and keep accounts, who needed a job and doesn't have a lot of other options at the moment." She looked at him. "Is that sufficient?" He looked back at her then, and there was something behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition, the way one person sometimes looks at another when they see something familiar in a situation. "It's sufficient," he said. He drank the last of his coffee, set the cup down, and stood up. "There's a room at the back of the house. My last housekeeper's. It's yours." "Thank you." He started toward this door, then stopped. "Aldridge," he said. "His property sits south of mine. If you see him or any of his men on this side of the creek, you come find me." She set down the plates she was carrying. "Is that likely?" Wyatt's expression didn't change, but something around his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's possible," he said. "He and I have a difference of opinion about where our properties begin and end." "The water," she said. It wasn't a guess exactly. It was what almost every property dispute in country like this came down to. He looked at her. "The spring," he said. "Yes." He mentioned controlling water in his letters. I thought he meant his own. "He wants mine." Wyatt said it simply, without anger, which somehow made it sound more serious. "Has for a while." "And you're bringing me here instead of leaving me on that platform." "Had nothing to do with Aldridge," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She studied him. "All right," she said finally. He nodded once and went out. She heard the door close and then his footsteps crossing the porch. Evelyn finished clearing the table, washed the dishes in the basin, hung the tablecloth back on the line to air, and then stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the evening. Through the window, she could see the last of the light going out of the western sky, a slow fade from orange to purple to nothing. She thought about Duncan Aldridge standing on that platform, the particular way he had looked at her, the careful cruelty of suitable. She thought about what it meant that she was standing in a stranger's kitchen 8 miles from town with no plan beyond the next day's work. Then she thought about the stew and how Pete had taken thirds and how nobody at that table had looked at her the way Aldridge had. She dried her hands and went to find the back room. Us. She had been at the ranch for 4 days when she first understood the nature of what she'd stepped into. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She had identified a backlog of unwashed linens that wanted attending to when she heard the men talking in the yard. Not arguing, just talking, but with the particular edged quality of men who are being careful with their words because they know the situation is not uncomplicated. She wasn't trying to listen, but the wind was behind her and sound travels in open country. "Cut the north fence again," Pete was saying. "Third time this summer." "Wyatt know?" That was the young one, Colt. "He knows." "He do anything about it?" A pause. He rode out and looked at it, filed a report with the county office. "A report." Colt's voice had a skeptical edge. "Aldridge has the county sheriff in his pocket." I know that. You know that. Doesn't mean Wyatt stops filing. Another pause. You think he'll actually try something? Aldridge? Son, he's been trying things for 3 years. Question is whether he'll stop trying subtle ones. The conversation moved away as the men drifted toward the barn, and Evelyn hung the last of the sheets and stood looking at the line of white cloth moving in the hot breeze. 3 years. And now she was here, having arrived on a train to marry the man who had been systematically trying to undermine Wyatt Granger's operation. That was a particular kind of coincidence, or it was no coincidence at all, and she wasn't sure which possibility sat worse with her. She found Wyatt that afternoon in the tack room, working at a piece of harness with patient, methodical attention. I want to ask you something directly, she said. He glanced up. All right. Aldridge's letters to me. They started in early spring. Around the same time, I'm guessing, that his attempts on your property started getting more serious. A man like that, bringing a wife here, was that about establishing himself, making himself look more settled, more legitimate? Wyatt set the harness down. He looked at her with that steady attention she was coming to associate with him, the sense of a person who actually thought before they spoke. Probably, he said. He wants this valley. To get it through legal channels, he needs to look like the stable, established rancher and make me look like the problem. A wife would help with that picture. And I was supposed to be the wife. You were supposed to be the wife. She leaned against the doorframe. So my arriving here and taking work with you instead, that's going to make him angry. It already has. I heard from 2 people in town this morning. He paused. I want you to know, if you decide this situation isn't something you want to be in the middle of, I won't hold you to anything. You can go. I'll pay the train fare, same as he offered. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that clearly enough. He was giving her an actual choice, without the performance of obligation that Aldridge's offer had carried. Do you believe he'll do more than cut fences? She asked. Eventually, yes. Then you need the help, she said. Not from me particularly. You need people who aren't going to leave when things get complicated. I've got 4 men who've stayed through 3 years of this. Then you've got 5, she said, and pushed off from the doorframe and went back to the laundry. She met Wyatt's history in pieces over the following 2 weeks, the way you learn most things about most people. Not from a single conversation, but from accumulated fragments, words dropped in passing, things mentioned and then moved away from, silences that had weight. He had built the ranch from ground that had been close to worthless when he'd arrived 12 years prior, barely 28 years old, and with limited capital and an almost unreasonable certainty that the creek-fed land north of what would become Harlan Creek had potential no one else was seeing. He had been right. The spring that fed his property, a reliable, year-round source in a territory where water reliability was life and death for cattle operations, was the anchor that made everything work. He had put in years of work that she was only beginning to understand the scale of, and then Duncan Aldridge had arrived 5 years ago with money and ambition and had immediately identified the spring as the piece of the puzzle he needed. The wife Wyatt had brought here 10 years ago had left after 3. She had come from somewhere east, someone had mentioned, and hadn't been able to settle into the life. He didn't discuss it. Evelyn didn't ask. There was a photograph on the mantel of a woman in a light-colored dress who looked very young and slightly uncomfortable, and after a few days, Evelyn stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing furniture. What she did notice was the way the ranch ran. Wyatt knew every part of his operation with the particular intimacy of a man who had built it himself and never stopped paying attention. He moved through the days with a quiet efficiency that she came to recognize as the organizing principle of the place, not commanding exactly, more like setting a tone that the other men followed without being asked. Pete had been with him 9 years. Colt was 22 and somewhere between an apprentice and a son, in a way that neither of them seemed to acknowledge directly. The other 2, Amos and a large, quiet man everyone called Dutch, had arrived in different years and stayed for their own reasons. Evelyn worked. That was what she did, and it was, she found, steadying in the way of useful labor. The house came back to itself incrementally, room by room, surface by surface. She established a garden that had been abandoned for at least a season, clearing the encroaching weeds and coaxing what was still viable back toward productivity. She reorganized the pantry and the root cellar and started keeping track of supplies with the same accounting habits she'd developed at the mill, making a running inventory on a piece of paper tacked inside the pantry door, that Wyatt glanced at one morning, and then looked at again with more attention, with more, "This is useful," he said, meaning the list. "I know what's there, what's running low, and what we'll need for the next month," she said. "If you tell me what months get hard for supply runs, I can plan accordingly." He told her. She planned accordingly. She learned the rhythm of the ranch. She learned that Pete's coffee was almost undrinkably strong and that the men preferred it that way. She learned that Dutch had a hand that ached in cold weather, and that if she left a cloth soaked in warm water near the stove in the mornings, he would use it without comment, and his grip would be better for the rest of the day. She learned that Colt read, which seemed to surprise him that she noticed, and that Wyatt read too. History mostly, some law, the kind of dry material that most people found impenetrable, and that she had always found oddly comforting. She did not learn much about what Wyatt felt. He kept that part of himself in a space she couldn't see into clearly. He was fair. He was consistent. He said thank you when it was warranted and said nothing when it was not. He worked as hard as any of his men, harder most days, and she understood gradually that the respect his men showed him wasn't about authority. It was about having watched him for years and finding nothing to disrespect. She had not expected to like him. She had not expected much of anything after the train platform. But liking, she found, had a way of arriving regardless. The first time someone in town said something to her face was on a Thursday when she rode in with Colt to collect supplies. She had braced for it, and braced for the wrong thing. She had expected something from a man, some reference to her situation, her arrival, the public nature of what had happened on the platform. Instead, it came from a woman, 50s, well-dressed in the frontier way, standing outside the mercantile with another woman of similar age and similar expression. "Miss Mercer," the woman said, as Evelyn was coming out of the store with a parcel. The use of her name told her the woman had made a point of learning it. "I'm Mrs. Calloway. I understand you're working at Granger Ranch." "That's right," Evelyn said. "Just the two of you out there, then? No chaperone?" "There are also 4 ranch hands," Evelyn said pleasantly. "It's quite a full household." Mrs. Calloway's expression suggested she found this an inadequate answer. "You understand how it looks?" "I understand how some people choose to make it look," Evelyn said. "That's not the same thing." She shifted the parcel under her arm. "It was nice to meet you, Mrs. Calloway." She walked back to the wagon where Colt was loading supplies. He had clearly heard the whole exchange. He didn't say anything, but he moved slightly faster with the loading, and when they were out of town and rolling north, he glanced at her sideways. "You handled that clean," he said. "I've been underestimated by better women than her," Evelyn said. Colt laughed, which surprised her. It was a real laugh, sudden and genuine, and he looked younger for it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She reported the exchange to Wyatt that evening, not because she felt she needed to, but because she'd decided transparency was the more useful policy. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Calloway's husband runs the town council. She talks, and people listen." "I know. You're not worried about it?" "I'm worried about the same things I was worried about before she said anything," Evelyn said. "I don't have a lot of room in my concerns for what someone like her thinks." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "She's probably going to say worse." "Then I'll handle worse," Evelyn said. "Same way." Something moved behind his eyes, that thing she couldn't always identify, the thing that showed up sometimes when she said something that seemed to catch him sideways. He nodded and went back to the map he'd been looking at, some survey of his property lines, and Evelyn went back to the kitchen. She heard him, 15 minutes later, get up from the table and walk out to the porch. And she heard him standing there for a while in the evening, quiet, before he came back inside. 2 weeks after her arrival, she was helping Pete catalog the smokehouse inventory when Amos came in fast from the north pasture. "Fences are down," he said. "North and west. Cattle are scattered." Pete swore under his breath and went for his horse. Evelyn followed to the barn and helped saddle up faster than she'd done before, hands working on the straps with a certainty that surprised her, and then stood in the yard as the 4 men rode north. Wyatt paused his horse beside her. "Stay close to the house," he said. She looked up at him. He looked back down at her. Some negotiation happened between them in that look that wasn't quite about the fence at all. "I'll have food ready when you're back," she said. He nodded and rode. She went inside, stoked the fire, and began cooking. While she cooked, she thought about Duncan Aldridge sitting south of here with his ambitions and his anger, and she thought about the photograph still on the mantel, and she thought about a man who had built something real out of difficult ground and was being slowly, systematically attacked by someone who wanted to take it. She thought about being suitable and what that word had really meant. The men came back at dusk, filthy and tired, and she had supper waiting. Wyatt came in last, and she could see from the way he held himself that the news from the fence line was not good. Not catastrophic, the cattle were mostly recovered, but not good. He sat down at the head of the table, and she put food in front of him, and he looked at it for a moment without eating. "He's testing," Wyatt said quietly. Mostly to himself, but she was near enough to hear. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her. "He's trying to find the edge," she said. "The place where the cost of staying starts to look higher than the cost of going." She paused. "How many people has he done this to?" Wyatt looked back at his plate. 3. 2 sold out, 1 didn't. He picked up his fork. The one that didn't had the county threaten to seize his land on a tax dispute that turned out to be manufactured. What happened? He left anyway. Evelyn sat down across from him, which she didn't normally do. The men were already eating further down the table, and none of them seemed to find this remarkable. "What's different about your situation?" she asked. "The spring," he said. "Without it, he can run maybe half the cattle, and he knows it. He's built his whole operation around eventually having that water. So he can't stop. Not until I do." He looked at her. "Or until something changes enough that he can't continue." She thought about that while the men ate and the evening settled around them. "What would have to change?" she asked. He set down his fork and looked at her with a directness she hadn't seen from him before. Or maybe she had, and she was only now prepared to really see it. "People would have to stop being afraid of him," he said. Evelyn looked back at him across the table. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a coyote was calling to something or nothing. The lantern on the table threw warm light against the walls. "People stop being afraid," she said, "when they see someone else standing." "Generally, yes." "Then we stand," she said. It was, she reflected afterward, a simpler sentence than the situation warranted. But it was true, and they both knew it, and sometimes truth was the only kind of plan worth having. She got up and cleared the table, and the evening went on, and outside the ranch sat under a wide sky, waiting. The morning after Evelyn said we stand, she woke before dawn with the particular clarity that sometimes follows a decision. Not peace exactly, but a settled quality, the way a room feels after you've moved the furniture to where it actually belongs. She built the fire, put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky go from black to gray to the pale, uncertain color of early morning, while she thought through what standing actually required in practical terms. She had said the words easily enough, sitting across a table from Wyatt Granger in the lantern light. The difficulty was that words required follow-through, and follow-through in a situation like this required knowing what you were dealing with. She was still at the window when Wyatt came through the kitchen on his way to the barn. He stopped when he saw her already up, which she understood meant it was earlier than he'd expected. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured a cup, leaned against the counter, and drank it standing up the way he always did first thing. She had observed that he was not a man who eased gradually into the day. He came awake all at once, like a lamp being lit. "I want to know more about Aldridge," she said. "Not the land dispute, the man." Wyatt looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I'm not asking out of personal interest," she said. "I spent 4 months reading his letters. I know something about how he thinks. If I understand him better, I can be more useful to you." A moment passed. Wyatt drank his coffee and looked out the window at the lightening sky and seemed to be deciding something. "He came here 5 years ago with money from somewhere east," he said. "Nobody knows exactly where, or nobody's saying. He bought the Harmon property south of the creek, expanded fast, and started looking for leverage almost immediately." He set down the cup. "He's not stupid. That's the thing people mistake about him. They see the bluster, and they underestimate what's underneath it. He knew exactly what he was doing on that platform," Evelyn said. "The way he looked at me. That was calculated. Everything he does is calculated. Including the fence cutting? That's frustration leaking through the calculation," Wyatt said. "He's been patient for 3 years and it hasn't worked. The fence cutting started this summer. That's him losing patience. Losing patience means making mistakes. It also means escalating. She nodded. She had already understood that part. Who in town would stand with you if it came to something formal, legal, or public? He was quiet for a moment. Tom Birch over at the feed store. The Halverson brothers north of here. They've had their own run-ins with Aldridge. A couple others, maybe, if something actually visible happened. He paused. Most people want to stay out of it. Most people stay out of things until they see someone else who isn't staying out, she said. That's just how it works. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He looked at her with that particular steadiness she'd come to expect, the look that neither agreed nor disagreed, but took everything in. You sound like you've been in this kind of situation before. Not like this, she said, but close enough. He went out to the barn, and she poured herself a cup of coffee and started on the biscuits, and the morning began in earnest. What she hadn't told Wyatt, because it wasn't directly relevant, and because she didn't discuss it generally, was that she had watched her father spend the last 3 years of his life in an argument with the railroad company he worked for over a safety issue he'd identified on a section of track he maintained. He had raised it through proper channels. He had been ignored. He had raised it again. He had been reassigned. By the time a section of track failed and 2 men were hurt, the railroad had managed to ensure there was no paper trail connecting their dismissal of his concerns to their liability. She had watched him try to fight it. She had watched what happened to a man who tried to fight an institution that controlled the narrative. She had learned 3 things from that experience: that power protects itself, that documentation matters more than testimony, and that the only reliable strategy against a well-resourced opponent was to be more patient than they expected. She hadn't been able to do much for her father. She could do something here. That afternoon, she asked Pete about the fence incidents. All of them, going back to when they started. Pete was a methodical man who mistrusted sentimentality but valued accuracy. And he'd been keeping mental track of things the way men who've worked a piece of land for a long time keep track. Not written down, but precise. Everything filed away in a particular order. Evelyn borrowed paper from Wyatt's desk and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Pete talked and she wrote. When she was done, she had a list covering 3 years: dates, locations, nature of damage, estimated cost, who'd been nearby, what the weather had been, whether tracks or signs had been found. She read it back to Pete and he made 2 corrections and approved the rest. She took the paper to Wyatt's desk that evening and left it there with a note that said simply, "Organized version of what Pete knows. Consider whether a formal record like this has legal value." She didn't push it. She went to bed. In the morning, the note was gone and the paper was still there, and Wyatt said, over coffee, "I'm writing to the Territorial Land Office next week. This helps." That was enough. The transformation of the house continued alongside everything else, room by room, problem by problem. She attacked it the way she'd attacked the account books at the mill, systematically, without sentiment, identifying what was structurally wrong before addressing what was merely aesthetic. The back bedroom, which had been used for storage, she converted into a proper workroom with a table and shelves so that she wasn't doing the mending and the bookkeeping and the preserving all at the kitchen table simultaneously. The porch got a coat of paint it had been needing since at minimum the previous spring. She fixed a window latch that had been letting in night air and presumably had been doing so long enough that nobody remembered it worked any differently. She planted seeds in the garden that she knew would not come to much before autumn, but that would be ready to transplant properly next spring if she was still here to do it. That was a thought she let herself sit with briefly and then moved past. She was here now. She was useful. That was what mattered. The men adjusted to her presence in the house in different ways and on different timelines. Pete had accepted her immediately, with the frank pragmatism of a man who had never wanted to be the cook and was relieved to no longer be the cook. Colt treated her with a cautious respect that gradually became something more natural, less performative. Amos was shy about talking to her directly, but went out of his way to do small, helpful things, leaving extra firewood stacked near the kitchen door, bringing her the first ripe tomatoes from the garden she'd been nursing back to life. Dutch took the longest. He was not unfriendly, but he was self-contained in a way that she understood was his nature, rather than resistance to her specifically. After 3 weeks of minimal exchange, he came in one afternoon while she was wrestling with the stuck drawer of the kitchen dresser. He watched her for a moment, then said, "You need to lift and push at the same time," and demonstrated. The drawer came open. He went back outside without further comment. After that, they were fine. Wyatt remained the most complicated part of the household to read, not because he was difficult, but because he was careful. He had spent years, she suspected, being a man whom other people projected things onto, authority, toughness, whatever the situation seemed to call for, and he had learned to offer very little surface for projection. What was underneath was present. She felt it in the way the house felt different when he was in it versus when he'd ridden out for the day. She just couldn't always see it clearly. What she could see clearly was that he was watching her with the same quiet attention she'd felt from the first day, and that his watching had changed quality over the weeks. At first it had been the watchfulness of a man assessing someone he'd taken a risk on. It was becoming something else. She wasn't sure either of them was ready to name it, and she was reasonably certain that naming it precipitously would undo whatever it was, so she left it alone and kept working. The first rumor reached her through an unlikely channel. She had made a point of going into Harlan Creek with Colt every Thursday, partly for the practical reason of provisioning, and partly because she understood that visibility mattered. Being seen in town, being known, being someone people could not easily reduce to a whispered story about a woman living out of wedlock at a bachelor rancher's property. This was work, the same as any other work. She had developed a routine of stopping at the dry goods store, where the owner's wife, a practical woman named May, who seemed to evaluate people primarily on whether they paid their accounts promptly, had moved from watchful neutrality to something approaching cordiality. May talked while she filled orders, not gossiping exactly, but sharing information in the way of someone who considered themselves a keeper of the town's ledger. On a Thursday at the end of Evelyn's third week, May said, while measuring out flour, "Heard you've been having fence trouble north of the creek." "Some," Evelyn said. "People are saying—" May paused, recalibrated. "Well, I'll tell you what's going around so you know, because I think you should know. There's talk that it's Wyatt's own men doing it, sabotaging from the inside, then claiming it's outside interference." Evelyn kept her expression even. "That's an interesting story. Where did it start?" "Couldn't say exactly. These things spread like seed. Hard to find the first planting. But it's going around. It's going around." Evelyn bought her flour and thanked May and walked back to the wagon and drove the 8 miles home, thinking carefully. By the time she pulled into the yard, she had her response to this particular problem mostly formed. She told Wyatt at supper, in front of the men. She had decided that doing it in front of them mattered, that they should hear her say it and see that she was saying it plainly and understand that she was not concerned about their loyalty, even if someone else wanted to make it a question. "There's a story going around town that the fence damage is being done from the inside," she said, "that it's someone on this ranch." The table went very still. Pete set down his fork. Dutch and Amos looked up from their plates. Colt looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Evelyn with an expression that was carefully controlled but had something working behind it. "I don't know who's doing the actual spreading," she continued, "but I know where that kind of story generally comes from, and I know what it's designed to do. I'm telling you all because I think you should hear me say I don't believe it, rather than wondering whether I do." A beat of silence. Pete said, "We've been with Wyatt between 4 and 9 years, each of us." "I know that," she said. "I'm saying so anyone present understands it's on record." "It's on record," she agreed. She looked at Wyatt. He was looking at her with that thing she couldn't quite name, sharper than usual. "It's Aldridge," he said. "Obviously." "Obviously," she said. "So we counter it the same way we counter everything else, by being visible and being consistent. If anyone asks me directly, I'm going to say the men at Granger Ranch have worked there between 4 and 9 years and have never given reason for doubt. I'm going to say it plainly and without defensiveness, because defensiveness looks like something to hide." She picked up her fork. "That's all I had to say." The table came back to life, slowly, with the particular texture of men who had been braced for something and then not received it. Pete ate. Amos ate. Colt glanced sideways at Dutch, who was already looking back at his supper with his usual impenetrable calm. Afterward, Wyatt helped her clear the table, which he had never done before. He did it without comment, as though he always had, picking up plates and carrying them to the basin while she washed. When the table was clear, he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" "For the way you said it. In front of them." She rinsed a plate. "They deserve to hear it. That's all." He was quiet for a moment, drying his hands on the cloth. I've been dealing with Aldridge's angles for 3 years. You've been here a month and you're thinking 3 moves ahead. You're thinking 3 moves ahead too, she said. You're just too close to it. Fresh eyes sometimes help. He didn't answer, and she glanced at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen flickers of before, but not this openly. Something unguarded in it. Something that was not quite gratitude because it was larger than that. Go look at your land records, she said. I want to talk to you about something tomorrow. The expression closed back up, but gently. He nodded and went. What she'd wanted to talk to him about was the water, not the dispute over it. She understood that well enough. But the physical documentation of the spring itself. Who had surveyed it, when, what the recorded boundaries were, whether the paperwork at the county office accurately reflected the legal reality. She raised this the next morning and watched Wyatt go still in the particular way of someone who had not thought of a specific angle and was now thinking of it very fast. The original survey, he said. When was it done? 12 years ago, when I filed for the property. And Aldridge arrived 5 years ago. What's the gap between his arrival and when the dispute started? About a year. So he spent a year looking at the documentation before he started pushing. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What if the documentation has problems? Not with your ownership. That's clear enough. But with the specific boundaries of the spring access. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear Colt talking to one of the horses, that low, easy murmur he used. There was a surveyor I didn't entirely trust, he said slowly. He was fast. I was in a hurry. I looked at the finished work and it seemed right. Do you have a copy of the original survey? In the desk. I'd like to look at it, she said. I kept accounts. I understand how to read a document for what it actually says versus what it appears to say. He got the survey. They spread it on the kitchen table and she looked at it for a long time. The property lines, the markers, the language describing the spring's relationship to the boundary. Wyatt stood beside her, and she could feel his attention on the page even though she was the one reading. Here, she said finally, pointing to a section. This language, it describes the spring as being within the property boundary, but it uses this phrasing, adjacent to the north marker. That's ambiguous. Meaning? Meaning if Aldridge hired someone to argue it, they could argue that adjacent to doesn't definitively establish inclusion within. It's a hair's width distinction, but in a legal dispute, that's enough to create doubt. Wyatt looked at the document. His jaw tightened. I'm not saying he has a legal claim, she said quickly. He doesn't. But if he can create enough legal uncertainty, he might not need to win. He might just need to tie you up long enough that the costs of fighting become unsustainable. That's his play, Wyatt said. Exactly. He straightened up from the table. I need to get this resurveyed properly. By someone you trust. I know a man in Cheyenne. Took 2 years to get an appointment last time. He looked at the survey. I'll send a letter today. She nodded. In the meantime, anything else you can document about the spring? Witnesses who've seen you use it? Records of improvements you've made to it? Anything that establishes long continuous use? Add it to what I started with Pete. He looked at her then, the document still between them on the table. When you took this job, he said, you were looking for somewhere to land. Yes. You didn't expect it to involve any of this. No, she agreed. But it does, so. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the survey. I'll get the letter to Cheyenne written before noon, he said. It was another 10 days before Aldridge made his next move, and this one was more personal. Evelyn was coming out of the mercantile in town. Alone, which was unusual, but Colt had gone to the feed store, and she'd wanted 10 minutes of her own. When 2 men she didn't know fell into step behind her. Not close enough to be immediately threatening, but close enough that she was aware of them. She kept walking at a steady pace. You're the Granger woman, one of them said. Not a question. She turned around. They stopped, which told her they hadn't decided quite how far they were taking this. They were both younger than she'd expected from their voices. Late 20s, the kind of men who did various kinds of work for whoever paid them. I work at Granger Ranch, she said. Yes. Must be interesting work, the other one said. Something in his tone suggested he meant it in the particular way men sometimes meant things about women living in men's households. She looked at him steadily. It is, she said. Bookkeeping, housekeeping, organizing the supply records. Very interesting. She paused. Tell Mr. Aldridge that if he has a message for Mr. Granger, he can deliver it himself. She turned and walked away at exactly the same pace she'd been walking before. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the feed store, which she was annoyed about. She clasped them together until they stopped. She told Wyatt when she got back. She told it plainly, without dramatizing, and watched his face while she did. What she saw there was not pleasant. He's escalating, Wyatt said. He's testing, she said. Same as always, just a different kind of test. You were alone. I was on a main street in the middle of the afternoon. Nothing was going to happen. She looked at him. I'm not going to stop going to town. I'm not asking you to. Good. A pause. They looked at each other. There was something crackling in the air between them that wasn't quite anger, or not only anger, but something that had been building gradually over weeks of proximity and common purpose, and was pressing against the surface of things. Next time you go alone, he said, take the small pistol from the kitchen drawer. I know you know how to use one. I've seen how you handle yourself. She hadn't told him she knew how to use a pistol. She thought about how he'd arrived at that conclusion, what he'd observed about her that had told him. All right, she said. He started to turn away. Wyatt. He turned back. She had not used his first name before. She registered this the same time he did, from the slight shift in his expression. He's going to try the rumors again, she said, harder this time. When he sees they haven't worked, he'll try to make them worse. I want you to be prepared for what people might say. About you. About me. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't care what they say, he said. You should care a little, she said. Not because it matters about us, about our characters, but because reputation is leverage in a legal dispute, and he knows that. What do you want me to do? Keep being exactly who you are, she said. Be seen. Be in town. Have people see you conducting your affairs with complete normalcy. Let them draw their own conclusions about which man in this valley looks like he has something to hide and which one doesn't. Something in his expression shifted. That thing behind his eyes, the private thing, moved closer to the surface. You think about this like someone who's run a campaign, he said. I think about it like someone who's watched an institution try to bury a person who was right, she said, and who learned from watching what works and what doesn't. He didn't ask her to explain further. He seemed to understand that this was as much as she was going to say about whatever she was referring to. I'll be in town Thursday, he said. I'll go to the bank, have lunch at the hotel, make myself visible. Normal business. Perfect, she said. He nodded. He started to leave again, and then stopped with his hand on the doorframe, not turning around. For what it's worth, he said to the doorframe, I'm glad you were on that platform. Not what happened to you there, but that you were there. He left before she could say anything, which was probably, she thought, just as well. She sat with that for several days, the way she sat with complicated things, not examining it too directly, letting it settle around the edges of her attention while she kept working. It was not the most efficient way to process information, but it was the way she actually functioned, and she had made peace with this about herself. What she knew, by the end of the 5th week, she was not here temporarily. She had stopped thinking of herself as temporarily here at some point in the preceding weeks and hadn't registered the exact moment of transition. The garden she was tending, the record she was keeping, the relationship she was building with the men and in town, these were not the actions of a woman marking time. She also knew that whatever was developing between herself and Wyatt Granger was real, and that it was not simple, and that neither of them was moving quickly toward it. This seemed appropriate. He had been burned before in a way he hadn't recovered from easily, and she had arrived on a platform having barely survived her own kind of burning. Proceeding slowly was not reluctance. It was sense. The work was also its own kind of connection. She had not expected that toy, the way shared labor built something between people without requiring words. She and Wyatt had developed a kind of rhythm that she only noticed when something disrupted it, the way you don't notice a clock ticking until it stops. What she was not prepared for was how quickly things could change. It started on a Wednesday, 2 days before she and Colt were meant to go into town. Pete came in from the east pasture in the early afternoon looking grim, and Evelyn knew from the way he looked before he'd said a word that it was not just the routine difficulties of a working ranch. "Cattle on Aldridge's land," he said. "About 40 head, the count I got. Northeast corner near the fence line." "How did they get there?" she asked, though she already knew. "Fences down, different spot from last time." He pulled off his hat. "Deliberate, same way. There are boot prints on our side that aren't any of ours. When did this happen?" "Sometime overnight." She set down what she was doing. "Where's Wyatt?" "Rode north this morning, back pasture." "Get Amos and ride north and get him. Go now." Pete went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, running through the immediate practical consequences. 40 head on Aldridge's land meant Aldridge could claim they'd strayed, could claim inability to determine ownership, could legally hold them up to a certain point. If he processed them, branded or sold, recovering them became a legal dispute rather than a simple retrieval. The longer Granger's cattle were on his land, the more complicated it became. When Wyatt came in, hard-ridden and already reading the situation from Pete's expression, she laid it out quickly and without padding. "If he moves on them in the next few hours, recovery gets complicated," she finished. "Legally, you need to be on his land with witnesses before he does." "I can't go on his land without—" "I know. Who in town is a notary? Someone who can witness a formal demand?" He thought fast. "Birch, the feed store man." "Can he ride?" "He can." "Then send Colt to get him now. You go to the fence line and document everything. The boot prints, the damage, the position of the cattle. Pete and Amos with you. When Birch arrives, you make a formal documented demand for return of your cattle." She paused. "Don't go on his land until Birch is there." Wyatt looked at her for 2 seconds. Just 2. Then he said Colt, and Colt, who had been standing in the doorway, was already moving. She went for paper and a pen and wrote as fast as she could while Wyatt told her the relevant details. Property descriptions, cattle counts, brand records. She had the basic framework of a formal demand written out before Colt was out of the yard, and she handed it to Wyatt and said, "This is just a framework. Birch will know the proper language." He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. "Come with us," he said. She hadn't expected that. I want you there." It was not quite a request and not quite an order. It was something else, something that acknowledged that she had become part of this in a way that went past housekeeping and bookkeeping. She got her hat. Tom Birch turned out to be a short, deliberate man in his 50s, who had been a notary in 3 different territories and seemed to find the whole situation grimly amusing in the way of someone who had seen too many property disputes to be surprised by any of them. He arrived on a stocky gray horse and assessed the situation at the fence line with the quick efficiency of professional habit. "Boot prints," he said, looking at the ground. "Yours are all accounted for?" "Every man's whereabouts last night is documented," Wyatt said. "Smart." Birch walked the fence line, made notes. "The cattle? Can you see them from here?" "East, about a quarter mile." "All right, we do this right." He looked at Evelyn, who was standing slightly back from the men with the paper she'd drafted in her hand. "Who are you?" "She works for Granger," Wyatt said. "She drafted the demand framework." Birch held out his hand. She gave him the paper. He read it in about 30 seconds. "This is sound," he said. "Cleaner than most I've seen from attorneys." He glanced at her. "Background in law?" "Bookkeeping," she said, "and watching my father try to fight a railroad company." He looked at her a moment longer and then made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "All right, let's go talk to Aldridge." She stayed at the fence line with Pete and Dutch, while Wyatt, Birch, Colt, and Amos rode toward the property line. She watched them go and thought about the man who had stood on a train platform and called her unsuitable, who had been writing her letters for 4 months while simultaneously plotting to take everything the man next to her had built. She thought about her father's railroad. She thought about documentation and patience, and the kind of slow, persistent pressure that sometimes worked where dramatic confrontation didn't. A hawk circled once, high and tilted, and then was gone. An hour later, Wyatt came back with 43 cattle and an expression that said the encounter had been unpleasant in several ways, but had gone technically in his favor. "He wasn't there," Wyatt said. "His foreman tried to refuse return. Birch read him the formal demand and told him it was already filed with a copy held at the feed store. And if they didn't release the cattle today, the next document would be a notice of theft filed with the sheriff's office, and that one would also have a copy held at the feed store. He paused. The foreman released them. Aldridge will know by tonight, Pete said.
He already knows, Dutch said quietly. It was, as far as Evelyn could recall, the longest sentence he'd said in her presence. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. They were both tired and dusty, and the afternoon had aged into that late gold light that made everything look more significant than it was. 1 point to us, she said. 1, he agreed. He'll answer it.
He will. So we keep going. She looked at the cattle being driven back through the repaired section of fence, Colt and Amos working the edges of the herd with the casual competence of men who had done this 100 times. We keep going, she said again. That evening she wrote up a full account of the incident, what had happened, when, who had witnessed, what the formal demand had said, what Aldridge's foreman had done. She added it to the growing file of documentation in Wyatt's desk. She had started thinking of it less as a record of wrongs and more as a ledger, one that was slowly, carefully, filling in their favor. She left the account on his desk and went to bed. Later, lying in the back room with the night sounds of the ranch outside her window, the particular quiet of a working property at rest, horses shifting, wind in the grass, something moving in the trees along the creek, she thought that she had arrived in Harlan Creek with nothing and had, without planning it, built something here. Not everything she had imagined for herself once, not the life she thought she was traveling toward. Something real, though, imperfect and complicated and real. She was still working out what to do with that when she fell asleep. The cattle incident bought them perhaps 2 weeks of quiet, which Evelyn understood was not peace, but preparation. Aldridge did not respond immediately. That was the tell. A man who responded immediately was running on emotion. A man who waited was running on strategy, and strategy was more dangerous. She said this to Wyatt on the Sunday after the cattle were returned, when the morning was still cool enough to sit on the porch with coffee without the heat making it miserable, and he looked at her sideways over his cup with an expression that said he had already been thinking the same thing and was mildly unsettled to hear it said aloud. He's deciding what the next move looks like, Wyatt said. He's deciding what the next move looks like and whether it's the last move, she said. The formal demand changed the calculus. Before, everything he was doing was deniable. The cattle retrieval, that's on record now. He doesn't get to pretend anymore that there's no dispute. That could make him more careful. Or less, she said. They sat with that for a moment. Down in the yard, Colt was working a young horse on a long line, the animal moving in wide circles, head high and nervous, learning that the rope was not a threat. It was patient work, repetitive and quiet. Tom Birch came to see me yesterday, Wyatt said, before you were up. She looked at him. He hadn't mentioned this. He said there are 2 other ranchers south of Aldridge's property who've had difficulties. Smaller operations. He didn't want to say so in public, but privately, fence trouble, water access disputes. One of them had a barn fire last autumn that the county called accidental. Accidental, she repeated. That's what they called it. She set down her cup. Did Birch say whether they'd be willing to talk? He said they were scared. He said if someone asked them directly and gave them a reason to think it was safe, they might talk. What kind of reason? Wyatt looked at her. That's what I've been thinking about. She was quiet, turning it over. The horse in the yard had settled into the circle, head dropping, steps evening out. Colt had not changed anything about what he was doing. The animal had simply run out of fear. Numbers, she said finally. What? That's what makes people feel safe enough to speak. Not a promise of protection. Nobody can promise that out here and mean it. But numbers. If they know they're not alone, that there are others who will stand alongside them, that changes the calculation. She looked at Wyatt. How many ranchers in this valley have had some kind of run-in with Aldridge? He thought, 7, maybe 8, if you count the small incidents. And how many of them know about each other's incidents? A pause. Probably not many. Then that's where we start, she said. Not with a confrontation, with information. Let people know what they're actually part of. Wyatt was quiet for a long time, long enough that she almost thought he was going to disagree. Then he said, I've never been good at asking people to get involved in something that might cost them. I know, she said. That's why I'm going to be the one who asks. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she had stopped trying to fully interpret because doing so made her less effective, but she was aware of it the same way you are aware of weather moving in from the west. Not certain of the shape of it yet, but certain that something is coming. You do that, he said. It was not quite a question. I'll start with Birch, she said. He already knows the shape of things. He can help me understand who's approachable and who isn't. She picked up her cup. I'll need a day in town. Not Thursday. Sooner. Tomorrow, maybe. I'll take you myself, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said, and looked back at Colt and the horse, and that was the end of that part of the conversation. She spoke to Tom Birch on Monday in the back room of his feed store, with the door closed and the sounds of the street muffled to a low murmur outside. Birch listened to what she proposed with his hands folded on the table and his expression giving away almost nothing, which she had come to understand was his natural state rather than skepticism. When she finished, he said, The Halverson brothers are your best bet to start, Eric and Lars. They've got a spread about 4 miles northeast, been there 15 years, they're not going anywhere, and they know it. Aldridge tried to buy them out 18 months ago, and when they refused, he redirected the creek tributary that ran through the corner of their north pasture. Redirected it how? Dammed it up on his side. Legal gray area. He was technically on his own land, but the effect was to cut their water access for that pasture for 6 weeks in July. They had to move cattle, and it cost them. Birch paused. They filed a complaint. Sheriff said there wasn't enough evidence of malicious intent. Complaint died. Would they talk to me? I think they would, yes. Eric especially. He's got a temper about it that hasn't cooled. Birch looked at her. Who else do you want to reach? You mentioned a barn fire. Caldwell. James Caldwell, smaller operation, about 12 miles south. He's more cautious, lost more. Birch's expression shifted slightly. His wife left him after the fire. Said she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. He's been alone out there since. He might talk or he might not. I'd like to try. Birch studied her for a moment with the particular look of someone reassessing something they thought they'd already assessed. You're not from out here, he said. No. You've been here, what, 6 weeks? About that. And you're organizing a coalition of ranchers against a man who has the county sheriff in his pocket and more money than any 3 of the rest of them combined. He didn't say it with judgment. He said it the way someone states a set of facts to make sure everyone is working from the same information. You understand what you're walking into. I understand what Wyatt's been walking into for 3 years, she said. I'm just walking in beside him. Birch unfolded his hands. I'll get you an introduction to Eric Halverson, he said. What you do with it is up to you. The Halverson brothers were large, fair-haired men of Norwegian descent who conducted their operation with an organized ferocity that Evelyn found immediately reassuring. Eric, the older, met her at the gate of their property with the frank appraisal of a man who had no particular patience for anything except competence, and she made her case without preamble or softening, laying out what she knew, what Wyatt had documented, what the pattern looked like across the valley. Eric listened. Lars, who had come out of the barn halfway through, leaned against the fence post and listened without speaking. When she finished, Eric said, Why are you the one coming to us and not Wyatt? Because Wyatt has been fighting this alone for 3 years and has learned to be careful about asking people to take on his problem, she said. I've been here 6 weeks and I don't have that particular habit yet. Lars made a sound. She looked at him. He had a small smile she wouldn't have caught if she hadn't been looking. What do you want from us? Eric said. Right now, just confirmation that what happened to your water access is part of the same pattern as what happened to Wyatt's fences and Caldwell's barn. I want it documented, written down and dated and signed, and a copy held somewhere Aldridge can't get to. You think it'll come to a legal fight? I think it already is a legal fight, she said. It's just being conducted informally so far, which is to his advantage because he has the sheriff. If it becomes formal, if it goes to the territorial level instead of the county level, then informal arrangements with the county sheriff stop mattering as much. Eric looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them that required no words. You want our statement, Eric said. I want your statement, she confirmed. You'll get it, he said. And you can tell Caldwell that if he wants to add his
We'll back him up. He's been out there alone too long.
She rode back to Harlan Creek with a written and signed account of the water diversion, dated and witnessed by both Halverson brothers, folded into her bag. She felt, for the first time since the train platform, that the ground under her feet was solid in a specific and deliberate way. Not because the problem was solved, but because the shape of a solution had become visible. She did not mistake the outline of a thing for the thing itself. She had learned that lesson watching her father. But an outline was somewhere to start. Voici. Wyatt read the Halverson statement that evening at the kitchen table while she cleared supper. He read it through twice, which was a habit she'd noticed meant he found something significant. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Eric Halverson hasn't put his name to anything official in 15 years, he said. He doesn't trust paper. He trusts it now. What did you say to him? She thought about it. I didn't ask him to trust the paper. I asked him to trust that being on record was safer than not being on record. There's a difference. Wyatt looked at the statement again. We need Caldwell. I know. Birch says he's cautious. We should give him time to hear that the Halversons signed before we approach him. How long? A week. Enough time for word to travel naturally. If he hears it from someone other than us, it'll carry more weight. Pete, who was still at the table with his coffee, and had been listening to all of this with the easy comfort of a man who had stopped being surprised by Evelyn's thinking about 6 weeks ago, said, Lars Halverson drinks at the hotel bar on Friday nights. He'll mention it to 3 people before he goes home. Caldwell drinks there too. Evelyn looked at Pete. He shrugged and drank his coffee. A week then, Wyatt said. A week, she agreed. During that week, 2 things happened. The first was that the rumors about her changed in character. The story about Wyatt's own men sabotaging the fences had faded. It had never had enough specific detail to hold up under scrutiny, and Mrs. Calloway, who had apparently decided that Evelyn was a more interesting subject for speculation than a straightforward source of scandal, had shifted to a different narrative. That Evelyn had come west with the explicit intention of trapping a wealthy man into marriage, and that the scene on the train platform had been somehow contrived to this end. May at the dry goods store told her this on Thursday with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who considers information useful regardless of whether it's pleasant. She's saying you planned it, May said. Mrs. Calloway is a woman who has never done an unplanned thing in her life, Evelyn said. She assumes everyone operates the same way. May's mouth twitched. You want me to say anything? If it comes up. Evelyn thought about it. Tell the truth, she said, that I came here in response to a correspondence agency advertisement, that I was publicly rejected on arrival, and that I took the first honest work I could find. There's nothing in that story that requires defending. Some people will still make something of it. Some people will make something of anything, Evelyn said. I can't spend my energy on those people. She bought her flour and her salt and her dried fruit for the preserves she was putting up, and she went back to the wagon, and she did not think about Mrs. Calloway again until she was already home, which she counted as progress. The second thing that happened that week was smaller but landed harder. She was in the workroom on a Wednesday evening, entering the week's accounts in the ledger she'd set up for the ranch's finances. Wyatt had accepted this addition to her responsibilities without fanfare, which was the way he accepted most things she took on, when she found a discrepancy in the records from the previous winter. Not a large one, but specific. A payment made to a county assessor that did not correspond to any assessment in the documented record. She sat with it for a long time before she brought it to Wyatt. He was in the main room, and when she put the ledger in front of him and showed him the entry, she watched his face. He was already still in his usual way, but something went a different kind of still. I know what this is, he said. Tell me. He looked at it for another moment. Last winter, the county sent an assessor to value the property. I thought it was routine. They do it every few years. He paused. The assessment came back higher than I expected, significantly higher, which meant higher taxes. And you paid. I paid. But there's no copy of the assessment in your records. He said he'd file it at the county office, and I'd get a copy. He looked at her. I didn't follow up. Who was the assessor? Man named Grell. I'd never dealt with him before. She looked at the ledger. Do you know if a copy is actually on file at the county office? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I don't. Then we need to find out. Because if the assessment isn't on file, the payment was made to someone, not officially. She looked at him. And if the assessment was inflated deliberately and you can prove that, that's a different kind of leverage entirely. That's not a land dispute. That's fraud. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his hands on the sill, looking out at the night yard. She gave him the silence. He needed to think, and thinking for Wyatt required space. I need to go to the county seat, he said. Not Harlan Creek, the county seat. Yes. That's 2 days' ride. I know, she paused. I can manage things here. He turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past its usual careful restraint into something more direct. Not the hidden thing, something more immediate than that. The expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just registered fully that he is no longer carrying it alone. I know you can, he said. That's not what I'm thinking about. She waited. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that I built everything here by myself, and I got used to that, and I've been operating for 3 years like the only move I have is to hold on and wait him out. He looked at the ledger on the table. I didn't think about the assessor. I just paid and moved on because there was too much else to do. If you hadn't gone through these records, you would have found it eventually, she said. Maybe. Maybe not. He looked at her directly. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, she said. Something moved through his expression, a flash of something unguarded and then carefully contained. I'll ride out Thursday morning, he said. I'll be back by Saturday. I'll have the house in order. It's always in order, he said. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not why I'm glad you're here. In case that's not clear, she held his gaze. It's becoming clearer, she said. He nodded once and went to bed, and she sat at the table for a while longer with the ledger open in front of her, listening to the ranch settle into night around her. The quiet broke on Friday, the second day Wyatt was gone, at approximately 4 in the afternoon. She smelled it before she saw it, a change in the air that the body registered before the mind caught up, a quality of heat that was wrong for the direction of the wind, something underneath the ordinary smells of summer grass and dust. She was at the kitchen window filling the water basin when she looked south and saw the smoke. It was rising in a column that was too dark and too wide to be a cook fire or a controlled burn. It was rising from the south pasture, where the dry grass had been waiting all summer for exactly this. She was out the door before she had consciously made the decision to move. Pete was already in the yard, shading his eyes. Dutch and Amos were coming fast from the barn. Colt wasn't back yet from the north fence he'd been repairing. South pasture, Pete said. I can see that. She turned to Amos. Ring the bell, loud and long. Colt needs to hear it, and come in. Amos went for the bell without question. How many cattle in that pasture? She asked Pete. About 80 head. And the fence line? Which direction is the wind pushing it? Pete looked, assessed. East and north. If it runs free, it'll hit the east fence in maybe 30 minutes. After that, it's open grass all the way to the creek. And the creek, she knew, was where Wyatt had his spring. If the fire got to the dry brush along the creek bank before they could cut it off, the spring itself wouldn't burn. You couldn't burn water. But the fencing, the access structures, the equipment Wyatt had built around it over 12 years could be destroyed in an hour. We cut a fire break, she said, between the south pasture and the east fence. We need to get the cattle moving north first. She looked at Pete. Can you drive 80 head north with 3 men? Not easy, but possible. Possible, yes. Then you take Dutch and Amos and drive them north. I'll start on the fire break. Pete looked at her. Ma'am, I know what a fire break is, and I know where the tools are, she said. Go. She went. The work of cutting a fire break, scraping clear a line of earth wide enough to stop a grass fire from jumping, was not technical. It was brutal. And it was physical, and it required moving fast while the smoke moved faster. She had the shovel and the hand rake from the tool shed, and she started at the east fence line and worked south, throwing up dirt, tearing out dry grass by handfuls when the shovel was too slow. Moving in a line that she tried to keep straight because a break with gaps was worse than no break at all. The smoke thickened to the south. She could hear the fire now, Not flames exactly, more a hissing and a popping, the sound of things that had been holding moisture for months finally giving it up. The wind was behind her, and that meant the smoke was going east ahead of the fire, which gave her a few extra minutes she did not take for granted. She had cleared perhaps 40 feet of break when she heard hooves and looked up to find Colt coming in from the north at a hard run, reading the situation as he rode. He pulled up beside her, dropped from the saddle, and said nothing at all. Just tied his horse to the fence post and grabbed the second shovel she'd dragged out and started working the line beside her. They worked in silence, broken only by the physical sounds of the labor and the growing noise of the fire. Her hands, which were not soft to begin with after 6 weeks of ranch work, were bleeding slightly from the dry grass and the shovel handle before they were halfway done, and she ignored it with the focused disregard of someone who has decided the pain is not relevant to the current problem. "Cattle are moving," Colt said at one point, glancing north. She looked. She could see them. A dark mass moving away from the smoke, Pete and Dutch and Amos working the edges. "Good," she said, and kept digging. The fire reached the line of the south pasture fence before they had finished the break. She could see it now, the orange edge of it moving through dry grass, faster than she'd expected, faster than anything that size had a right to move. The heat pushed at them even from 200 yards. "We're not going to finish in time," Colt said, not panicked, just reporting. "We're going to finish what we have and hope it's enough," she said. They kept going. The fire reached the incomplete break with perhaps 10 feet still uncleared. She watched it hit the scraped earth and hesitate. Not stop, but hesitate, the way a wave hesitates at a barrier before finding the path around it. And she and Colt hit the remaining stretch with everything left in them, and the fire found the gap, and she saw the grass on the east side of the gap begin to catch. She beat it with the flat of the shovel. Colt stamped it with his boot. It was not elegant, and it was not what anyone would design if they had the luxury of planning. But the ground there was slightly lower and slightly less dry than the open pasture, and between the two of them and the slight advantage of terrain, they beat it back before it could take hold. The fire burned itself out against the break 30 feet to their right, finding nothing to consume, and died down to smoke and ember. She stood and breathed. Colt stood beside her with his hands on his knees, doing the same. Her arms ached from the shoulder to the wrist. She had a burn on her left forearm that she hadn't felt happening and was beginning to feel now. Her dress was ruined beyond any reasonable recovery. After a moment, she said, "How's your horse?" Colt straightened up. "Fine, tied north of the smoke. Let's see, good." She looked at what was left of the south pasture. Blackened earth, a few standing fence posts, smoke rising in thin columns from the remains. "Deliberate," she said. "Not a question." "There's no farmstead south of us," Colt said. "Nothing that could throw a spark that direction in dry weather with no lightning." He looked at the line of origin, the far south end where it had started. "Someone set it close to our fence line." She had known this before she'd smelled the smoke. She had known the moment the quiet of the past week had started feeling less like peace and more like the held breath before something happens. "Where was it lit?" she said. They walked the fire's edge to the south end of the burn. The grass was thinner near the fence line, grazed down by cattle over the summer, and the origin point was visible if you knew what you were looking at, a slightly more concentrated char, the radiating pattern of a fire that had started in one spot and spread rather than caught from a moving source. 6 inches from the fence post, on the other side of the fence. Aldridge's side. "Don't touch anything," she said. "Don't let anyone touch this. I want Tom Birch to see it before anything changes." Colt looked at the char mark. He looked at her. "Why it's going to—" "I know," she said. "First things first." She looked north toward the house, where she needed to check the cattle count and treat her arm and send a rider for Birch, and write down everything she could remember about the timeline while it was still fresh. "Come on." Tps. Pete met her in the yard with a look that collapsed into something like relief when he saw her walking, and then hardened again almost immediately when he saw her arm. "That needs tending," he said. "In a moment. Cattle?" 78 confirmed north, looking for the other 2. "All right. Amos?" She turned to find him already beside her. "Ride to Harlan Creek and get Tom Birch. Tell him it's urgent, and tell him to come to the south fence line first before he comes to the house." She looked at Amos until he nodded. "Go now." He went. She let Pete look at her arm. It was not as bad as it had felt. A burn perhaps 4 inches long, red and painful, but not deep. He cleaned it and wrapped it with the same practical efficiency he applied to everything, and she sat at the kitchen table while he worked and wrote down the timeline on paper. When she had smelled the smoke, when she had reached the yard, what the fire's position had been, what direction it moved, the point of origin, who had been where. Dutch came in from the north pasture. 2 more cattle found, he said. Totals 80. Good. She kept writing. When Pete finished with her arm, he poured her coffee without asking and set it beside her and went to start supper. She drank the coffee and kept writing until she had everything down that she could remember. And then she read it back and made 3 corrections and folded it and put it in the ledger with the Halverson statement. Tom Birch arrived 2 hours later with the particular unhurried speed of a man who understood urgency without being governed by it. She walked him to the south fence line herself and showed him the origin point and the char pattern and the position relative to the fence, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This is on his land, yes." That changes things considerably. "That's why I wanted you to see it before anything else," she said. "Can you document it officially?" "I can document it." He looked at the fence line, the blackened pasture beyond, the smoke still threading up from cooling embers. "This isn't a fence dispute anymore." "No," she said. "Wyatt, no. He's at the county seat. He'll be back tomorrow." Birch looked at her, the arm, the ruined dress, the composed face above it. "You did this," he said. "The fire break." "Colt helped. You organized it." She didn't argue the point. "Document what you need to document," she said. "I'll be at the house." She walked back alone across the burned edge of the south pasture. Stepping over the fire break she and Colt had scraped out of the dry ground, watching where she put her feet in the darkened earth. The sun was going down. The smoke was thinning. What was left of the pasture grass lay flat and black, and it would need to be reseeded in the spring, and the south fence line needed rebuilding, and all of it was going to cost money and time that Wyatt did not have in abundant supply. Aldrich had made his calculation. He had decided that patience wasn't working and that something faster was needed. He had made the choice to escalate from interference to destruction. She thought about that, about what it meant specifically that he had made that choice while Wyatt was out of town, which suggested he had known Wyatt was out of town, which meant he had eyes in Harlan Creek or closer. She filed that away. She would think about it when she'd had sleep and food and the immediate tasks were done. The house lights were on when she came through the yard, warm and yellow in the early dark, and she could smell Pete's supper from 20 yards out. Colt was on the porch. When he saw her coming, he stood up and then seemed unsure what to do with the standing, and she said, "You did good today." And he looked somewhere past her left shoulder and said, "So did you." And that was the extent of what either of them needed to say about it. She went inside. Wyatt came back on Saturday morning earlier than she'd expected, which told her word had traveled faster than the normal pace of travel. He came through the yard at a hard ride and was off his horse before it fully stopped, and he found her in the kitchen with her documentation spread across the table. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was wearing her second-best dress because the good green one was beyond saving, and her arm was wrapped, and she had slept about 4 hours the previous night. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it, in the order it had happened, without minimizing or dramatizing. She watched his face as she talked, and she was glad for his particular kind of stillness, the kind that held its shape even under pressure, because what was under the stillness was anger. She could see that clearly, and anger without shape had a way of moving toward the wrong targets. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the documentation on the table. He looked at her arm. "He knew I was gone," he said. "Yes, that was my thought too. Someone told him. Or he had someone watching the road out of town." She paused. "Either way, we need to account for it." He looked at the Birch documentation of the fire's origin. He looked at it for a long time. "This is on his land," he said, same as Birch had said it. "Yes. That's arson, not sabotage. Arson." "Yes," she said. "And with the county sheriff." "The county sheriff is not going to help us," he said. The anger had surfaced now, thin and controlled, the way ice is controlled by cold but has the water underneath. "We go to the territorial marshal. That's what I think too," she said. "But not yet. We build the file first. Everything, the fence incidents, the cattle, the false assessment, the water diversion on the Halversons, whatever Caldwell has. And the fire, properly documented by Birch. She looked at him. We go to the territorial marshal with the whole picture, not one incident, the pattern. He looked at her. The anger was still there, but it was being held. How long to put it together? 2 weeks, maybe 3. She held his gaze. I know that's hard. He could do something else in 3 weeks. He could. We watch for it. We don't go out alone. We keep the documentation going. She paused. He made a serious mistake with that fire, Wyatt. He escalated to something that can't be explained away as a land dispute. We don't squander that by moving too fast. He was quiet. Outside, Pete was saying something to Dutch in the yard. Some ordinary exchange about morning work, the uninterrupted rhythm of the ranch continuing around this still point in the kitchen. I found the assessment, Wyatt said, at the county seat. She hadn't expected this yet, had filed it behind the fire in her thinking. And? There's no Grell registered as a county assessor. The assessment I paid for doesn't exist in any official record. He looked at her. The money went somewhere, not to the county. She sat back. That's theft, not just fraud, outright theft. Under someone's name, someone who may or may not exist. Do you have documentation from the county seat? I have a letter from the county clerk stating that no assessment of my property was conducted last winter and that no assessor named Grell is registered in the county. He put the letter on the table beside her documentation. I had it notarized there. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that had come very far out of its usual careful containment, far enough that there was very little distance between what he felt and what she could see. We have enough, she said. Almost. Another week. Caldwell, if he'll talk. And we have enough for a territorial complaint that can't be dismissed. A week, he said. A week. He nodded. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she slid the documentation toward him, and they spent the next 2 hours going through every piece of it together at the kitchen table while the morning moved around them, organizing it into a shape that could be presented to someone who had the power to act on what it showed. Outside, the burned south pasture lay quiet in the growing day. The spring ran, as it always had, unaware of what was being arranged to protect it. They kept working. James Caldwell came to them. Evelyn had been prepared to ride out to his property herself, had already worked out in her head how she would approach him, careful, patient, giving him room to say no. But on the Monday after Wyatt returned from the county seat, Caldwell appeared at the gate of Granger Ranch on a gray horse that needed better feed than it was getting, and with the look of a man who had been making up his mind about something for a long time and had finally made it. She was in the yard when he came in. He was somewhere in his late 40s, thin in the way of someone who had stopped eating regularly rather than someone naturally lean, with a beard that was growing in without particular intention. He looked at her, and then at the house and said, Is Granger here? He is, she said. I'm Evelyn Mercer. I work here. He looked at her with the mild, unfocused recognition of someone who has heard a name without the context to make it fully meaningful. Birch told me about you, he said. Said you're the one organizing things. Birch is generous. Come inside. Wyatt was at his desk when she brought Caldwell in, and he stood and shook the man's hand with the quiet respect you give someone who has traveled a hard road and shows it. She put coffee in front of them both and sat at the end of the table with her paper, and did not make a performance of being ready to write. Caldwell wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at the table and said, The barn fire. Take your time, Wyatt said. No. Caldwell shook his head. I've taken enough time. I've been taking time for 9 months, and all it's done is leave me alone out there with nothing changed. He looked up. My wife left in February. She said she couldn't live with someone who kept absorbing damage without ever doing anything about it. His voice was flat about this, the flatness of something that had been painful long enough to go past the edge of acute pain into a different kind of ache. Maybe she was right. I don't know anymore. Evelyn did not say anything. Wyatt did not either. The barn went in October, Caldwell said. Middle of the night. I lost 2 horses, and about $400 in equipment and 3 months of hay I'd put up myself. The county deputy who came out said it was the lantern. I don't use a lantern in the barn. He looked at Wyatt. I know what a lantern fire looks like. I've seen one. It starts at the hook and burns down. This started at the base of the east wall.
Where the hay was stored, Evelyn said quietly.
Where the hay was stored, he confirmed. Before the fire. Any fence trouble? Water issues? Aldridge tried to buy me out in the spring, 6 months before the fire. Caldwell's jaw tightened slightly. I paid for that land. My father paid for part of it. It wasn't for sale. He paused. After I told him no, my east access road started having problems. Gates left open, so cattle strayed. A water trough on the south end got deliberately fouled. Someone put something in it, I don't know what, but it killed 2 calves before I figured out the source. He looked at his coffee. I thought if I kept quiet and kept my head down, it would stop. It didn't stop, Wyatt said. It got worse. Caldwell looked at the table. After the fire, I didn't have the energy anymore. The fight went out of me. He was quiet for a moment. Then Birch told me about the Halversons signing something, and about, he glanced at Evelyn, about what happened here with the fire in your south pasture. And I thought, if I stay quiet, I'm just making it easier for the next person he goes after. Evelyn was already writing. She wrote everything he said in the order he said it, and when he finished the main account, she asked him careful questions about dates and witnesses and whether anything had been documented at the time, and he answered each question with the drained thoroughness of a man unburdening himself of weight he'd been carrying alone for the better part of a year. When they were done, she read the account back to him. He made one correction, a date she'd written as October that he said was late September. And then he nodded and signed it, and she witnessed it, and Wyatt witnessed it, and it joined the Halverson statement and Tom Birch's fire documentation and the county clerk's letter in the ledger that was becoming the shape of a case. Caldwell stayed for supper without being asked, and Pete fed him, and he ate like a man who had been feeding himself badly and knew it, and nobody made anything of it. After supper, he sat on the porch with Wyatt for a while, and Evelyn could hear their voices through the kitchen window, low and unhurried, the particular register of 2 men talking about land and work and what it cost to hold on to something. And she washed the dishes and listened to the sound of it without listening to the words. When Caldwell left, he looked steadier than when he'd arrived. Not solved. Nothing was solved yet, but steadier. She understood that this was what it meant to not be alone with something. She wrote the formal complaint herself. She had not told Wyatt she was going to do this. She had told him she was going to organize the documentation into a format suitable for a territorial complaint, which was true, and she had not told him the extent to which she was planning to draft the complaint language itself, because she had not been sure she could do it until she started, and found that she could. She worked on it over 3 evenings at the table in the workroom while the rest of the house went about its business, and she worked the way she had worked on the mill's account books in Ohio, methodically, without rushing, building from the specific to the general rather than the other way around. Each incident first, date, nature, documentation, witnesses, financial impact. Then the pattern, the timeline of escalation, the relationship between incidents, the evidence of coordination between separate acts. Then the fraudulent assessment, the absence of official record, the notarized letter from the county clerk, the money paid to a non-existent official. She included everything. The fence cuttings and cattle drive, the Halverson water diversion, Caldwell's barn, the 2 men who had followed her in town, the fire in the south pasture with Birch's documentation of the origin point and its location on Aldridge's land. She was careful about language. She did not overstate. She did not use words like conspiracy or criminal enterprise because those were conclusions, and conclusions were not hers to draw. They were for whoever read this to draw, and she wanted whoever read it to reach those conclusions themselves from the facts, rather than feel they were being pushed. Her father's mistake had been in the emotional register of his complaints. He had been angry and right, and the anger had given the railroad's lawyers something to characterize as instability. She was not angry in the document. She was thorough. On the 4th evening, she put it in front of Wyatt. He read it for a long time. She sat across from him and waited. The lamp was low and the house was quiet, everyone else long since in bed. When he looked up, his expression was difficult to read in the lamplight, but she had gotten better at reading it in all kinds of light. "You did this," he said. "It reflects everyone's accounts. I just organized them." "You wrote this," he said. "This isn't organizing. This is a legal document. It's a complaint. It's not a brief. There's a difference." "Where did you—" He stopped, reconsidered. "This is what you learned watching your father." "What not to do, mostly," she said, "and what to do instead." He set the document down and looked at her with an expression that had left its usual borders considerably behind. "Who are you?" he said. Not unkindly, more like someone who has been looking at something in a certain kind of light for weeks and has just shifted the angle and seen it differently. "I'm the woman who needed a job," she said. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. I'm the same person I've been the whole time. You're just seeing different parts." He was quiet. He looked at the document. He looked at her. "I'll ride to the territorial marshal's office next week," he said. "Take Birch with you," she said. "His name is on the fire documentation. Having him present adds weight." "All right," he paused. "You should come too." She hadn't expected that. "Why?" "Because you wrote it. If they have questions about the organization of it or the reasoning behind what's included—" He paused. "Because you should be there," he said more directly. "You've been in this from the beginning. You should be there at the part where it actually goes somewhere." She considered this for a moment. The practical objections were manageable. Pete could run the household for 2 days without catastrophe, and her presence alongside Birch and Wyatt would either help or be neutral. The non-practical objection was something she sat with briefly, the awareness that going to the territorial marshal's office was a different kind of step than what she'd been doing, a more public one, a more committed one. She had stopped thinking of herself as temporarily here 6 weeks ago. She had already committed in every way that mattered without calling it that. "All right," she said. Before they could ride to the territorial marshal, Aldridge moved again. She should have expected it. She had expected it, in the abstract. She had told Wyatt that he would answer their one point with something of his own. She had not anticipated the specific form it took. On Wednesday morning, a man arrived at Granger Ranch with a document from the county courthouse. He was a young man in a clean coat, the kind of man who carries documents for a living, and he handed the document to Wyatt at the porch with the practiced, neutral expression of someone who has delivered bad news often enough to have stopped reacting to the receiving end of it. Wyatt read it. She watched his face. Then he handed it to her without speaking. It was a notice of tax lien, filed against Granger Ranch by the county assessor's office for non-payment of the reassessment conducted the previous winter, the reassessment that had no official record, the assessment conducted by a man named Grell, who did not exist. The filing claimed that the payment Wyatt had made was irregular and could not be credited against the official assessment, and that the outstanding amount, plus interest accrued since October, was due within 30 days or the county had authority to begin proceedings against the property. The amount due was $3,847. She set the document down. "The assessment that doesn't exist," Wyatt said. His voice was very controlled. "The money I paid to someone who doesn't exist. Now the county is claiming I owe it officially. He filed it," she said, "through a different channel. Not Grell. Whoever Grell actually is, they're gone. But Aldridge has someone in the assessor's office." She looked at the document. "This is his answer to the county clerk's letter. He found out you had it notarized, and he moved to establish the fraudulent assessment as official record before you could use the lack of record against him. Can he do that?" "He just did," she said. She picked up the document again and read it carefully, all the way through, every word. She was looking for the specific clerk name on the filing, the date, the authorization signature. She found them. She wrote them down on a separate piece of paper. "This actually helps us," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "The county clerk's letter says no assessment was conducted. This lien says an assessment was conducted and is overdue. Those two things cannot both be true. If we present both documents to the territorial marshal, we're not just showing a pattern of sabotage anymore. We're showing a contradiction in official county record that can only exist if someone in the county office is filing fraudulent documents." She set the paper down. He overreached. He was trying to neutralize the county clerk's letter, and instead he created evidence of official corruption. Wyatt was quiet. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now as the one he wore when something had just shifted in his understanding, and he was working out the implications. "We go to the marshal this week," he said. "Not next week. This week." "Thursday," she said. "Earliest we can get Birch and make the ride." "Thursday," he agreed. They did not make it to Thursday without another complication. On Wednesday afternoon, Evelyn went into Harlan Creek alone, which she had been doing without incident since she'd started carrying the pistol. She needed to tell Birch about the lien and the changed timing, and she wanted to do it in person rather than sending a rider. She found Birch in the feed store and told him quickly and watched his expression move through several phases of controlled response before settling on grim resolution. He agreed immediately to Thursday. She was heading back to the wagon when Mrs. Calloway materialized on the sidewalk outside the Mercantile with the specific purposefulness of someone who has been waiting. "Miss Mercer." The woman's voice had a new quality in it, still controlled, but brittle underneath. "I'd like a word." Evelyn stopped. "Mrs. Calloway." "I think you should understand what you're doing," Mrs. Calloway said. She kept her voice low, which made it more rather than less uncomfortable. "Wyatt Granger has been a source of disruption in this community for years. His refusal to reach a reasonable accommodation with Mr. Aldridge has caused difficulty for everyone. The decent thing, the sensible thing, would have been to sell and let things settle." "The sensible thing," Evelyn said, "is generally whatever benefits the person calling it sensible." Mrs. Calloway's color rose. "My husband is on the town council. Mr. Aldridge has been a significant contributor to this community's development." "Mr. Aldridge has committed arson," Evelyn said. "The fire in Granger Ranch's south pasture was set from his land. That's documented." She kept her voice at exactly the same level as Mrs. Calloway's. Low, conversational, the opposite of the train platform. "Your husband's position on the town council doesn't change what's in that document, and Mr. Aldridge's contributions to community development don't change where the fire started." She met the woman's eyes directly. "I'd be careful, Mrs. Calloway, about which side of this you're seen to be on when it reaches the territorial level, which it will, this week, in fact." Mrs. Calloway stared at her. Something in her expression moved. Not quite fear, but the close neighbor of it, a realization that the person she was looking at was not going to be moved, managed, or softened. She said nothing further. She stepped aside. Evelyn walked past her and got in the wagon and drove out of town and did not look back. Her hands were steady this time. She noticed that. The ride to the territorial marshal's office was long and produced a result that was neither as good as she'd hoped nor as bad as she'd feared, which was the nature of most real results. The marshal, a compact, methodical man named Deering, who had seen too many range disputes to get excited about any of them, received them in his office and read through the documentation with a thoroughness that Evelyn found reassuring. He read the Halverson statement and the Caldwell account. He read Birch's fire documentation. He read the county clerk's letter. He read the tax lien. He looked at the complaint she had drafted. He asked questions for an hour. Precise questions, the kind that exposed the structure of the argument and tested whether the structure was sound. She answered most of them. Birch answered the ones about the fire documentation. Wyatt answered the ones about the fraudulent assessment and the history of the property. When it was done, Deering set the papers down and said, "The fire documentation is your strongest piece. Physical evidence, professional witness, clear point of origin on Aldridge's land. The rest is a pattern, and patterns require interpretation. Judges don't always agree on interpretation." He paused. "The lien is interesting. A conflict between official county records is something the territorial office has authority to examine independent of any complaint from a private citizen." "Meaning?" Wyatt said. "Meaning I can open an investigation into the discrepancy in the county records without needing to rule on the fire or the other incidents first. If the investigation finds what your documents suggest, a fraudulent filing made by someone in the county assessor's office, that's a territorial matter, and it removes the county sheriff from the picture entirely." Birch leaned forward slightly. "You do that based on what we've brought?" "I'd open a preliminary inquiry," Deering said. Careful language, deliberately bounded. "I'm not promising outcomes. I'm telling you what I can do with what you've given me." And the fire? Evelyn asked. Deering looked at her. She had the impression he had been slightly surprised by her from the moment they walked in, had expected a supporting presence, and found something else. The fire gives me a second line of inquiry. Arson originating on private property that causes damage to a neighboring property. That's criminal, not civil. If the fire investigation supports the documentation, that's a separate process with a different evidentiary standard. How long? Wyatt asked. The records inquiry, a few weeks. I need to send someone to the county seat. The arson investigation, longer. These things move at the speed they move. Wyatt nodded once. He had been expecting this. She had prepared him for the likelihood that it would be slow. What do we do in the meantime? You keep your documentation current, Deering said. He glanced at Evelyn, and there was something in the glance that acknowledged who had produced the documentation they were sitting with. If anything else happens, anything, you record it immediately and send a copy here. Don't go through the county, send directly here. We'll do that, she said. They rode back with the afternoon sun behind them, the three of them largely quiet for the first hour, each processing in their own way. Birch rode between them, and at some point he said, to no one in particular, Well, it's moving. It's moving, Wyatt agreed. Evelyn said nothing. She was thinking about how things actually move. Not in dramatic moments, but in increments, each one small enough to seem insufficient, accumulating into something that cannot be stopped. The next 2 weeks were tense in a particular way, the tension of waiting on a process you have set in motion and cannot accelerate. She kept the house running, kept the records current, added to the documentation ledger twice when small incidents occurred. A water trough with a cut hose she was reasonably certain was not accidental. A section of newly repaired south fence that came down again. She sent descriptions of both to Deering's office directly, as he'd instructed, with dates and details. She also had a conversation with Wyatt that she had been not quite having for several weeks. It started, as many of their real conversations started, in an unplanned moment. She was in the kitchen in the early morning, and he came in from an early ride and poured coffee and sat down, and instead of looking at the ranch records or the maps he sometimes spread across the table in the mornings, he sat there and looked at her. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes after. She waited. If this works, when the inquiry produces something, when the arson investigation goes forward, eventually Aldridge's position in this valley is going to change. Maybe not everything at once, but it'll change. He turned the cup in his hands, a habit she had observed in him when he was choosing words carefully. And I've been thinking about what that means for the ranch. What it can be. He paused. What I want it to be. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him, the same position they always occupied at this table, and waited for him to say the thing he was working toward. I don't want you to leave, he said. She had known this was the sentence coming, had felt it approaching like weather. I'm not planning to leave, she said. I know, but He set the cup down. He was looking at her with the expression that she had been watching unfold over 10 weeks. The one that had started as watchfulness and moved through recognition and was now something she did not have a single word for, something that required the whole of what they had been to each other through fence lines and fire and documentation and long evenings at this table. I'm not talking about the job, he said. I know what you're talking about, she said. He looked at her. There was something uncertain in it. Not his commitment to the words, but the awareness that he was out past the territory he was practiced in, that this was ground he had crossed once before and found difficult and had been cautious about for a long time since. I'm not easy to live with, he said. I know that. I keep things to myself more than I should, and I work too many hours, and I get fixed on problems. I've noticed, she said. I'm telling you so you know I know. I have my own list, she said. I'm stubborn when I think I'm right, which is most of the time. I don't ask for help when I should. I've been known to take on other people's fights, and not always with their permission. She met his eyes. We're both aware of our own deficiencies. That's actually a reasonable starting place. He looked at her for a long moment. Is it a place you want to start from? She looked back at him. She thought about Ohio, and the train, and the platform, and a word that was supposed to diminish her. She thought about 8 miles of road and a house she had put back together room by room and a file of documentation that was, incrementally changing the shape of something. She thought about what it meant to find yourself building something you hadn't planned for in a place you hadn't intended to stay, and to find that the thing you were building was real. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard toward the barn, and somewhere north, Colt was working, and the ranch was running, as it did, as it had, as it would. "I'll need to get a ring," he said. "You have time," she said. "Nothing has to happen immediately." "No," he said. "I'd like it to happen soon." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something settled between them. Not a resolution exactly, more like two things that had been moving separately, clicking into the same motion, the way a clock's parts align when the mechanism is finally right. "Soon then," she said. The town found out the way towns find out things. Not from one source, but from many. The way water finds a way through ground, following the available cracks. Birch knew, and Birch's wife knew, and May at the dry goods store had the instinct for these things that comes from 20 years of listening while appearing to be looking at flour. By the following Thursday, when Evelyn came into Harlan Creek for provisions, the texture of the town's attention had changed in a way she could feel without being able to point to any single thing. May said, while weighing out dried beans, "I hear congratulations might be in order." And when Evelyn confirmed it without elaboration, May nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose read of a situation has proven accurate. On the street, the woman from the hardware store, a large, cheerful woman named Barbara, who had been pleasant to Evelyn from the beginning, stopped her and said simply, "Good for you, both of you." And that was that. Mrs. Calloway was not visible. Evelyn did not look for her. What she did notice, which mattered more than any of the social texture, was Eric Halverson coming out of the feed store while she was loading the wagon. He saw her, and his stride checked, and then he crossed to her with the direct purposefulness she had come to associate with him. "I heard about the lien," he said. "Birch told me." "Yes," she said. "And the marshal's inquiry." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, his expression doing the internal calculation she recognized. "Lars and I have been talking," he said, "about the others in the valley who've had trouble. We've been keeping mostly to ourselves these past few years, and I think that's been a mistake." He looked at her. "There are 7 operations between here and the south end of the valley. If we were in regular contact, if we knew what was happening on each other's land as it happened rather than after, things like that fire might have been caught faster, or prevented." "An agreement between ranchers," she said. "Nothing formal, just a commitment to communication." He paused. "Wyatt have any objection to that kind of arrangement?" "I think he'd welcome it," she said. "Reach out to him directly. He'd want to hear it from you." Halverson nodded. He started to go, then turned back. "That fire," he said. "Word is you organized the fire break." "Colt and I," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, from a man like Eric Halverson, essentially the equivalent of a long speech. Then he said, "Good," and went back about his business. She finished loading the wagon and drove north through the afternoon heat with the particular feeling of something shifting under her feet. Not the precarious shift of ground giving way, but the specific different sensation of ground consolidating, of things that had been loose finding their proper weight and settling into it. The ranch came into view on the long approach, visible for a mile in the open country, the main house and the barn and the outbuildings and the pastures recovering their green at the edges where the burn had stopped. She could see someone working the south fence line. Amos, she thought, from the build. And the ordinary sounds of the ranch reached her before she was fully in the yard. Wyatt came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He helped her down with the same hand he always offered, but this time he held it a moment longer than necessary, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about it. "Halverson wants to talk to you," she said, "about a communication agreement among the Valley ranchers." He looked at her. "Eric Halverson." "Yes." Something in his expression moved, something old and held against itself. The look of a man who had spent years standing alone and is only now beginning to register that he isn't. "All right," he said. His voice was slightly not his usual voice, but close enough that she understood he was managing it. She carried the first bag in. He carried the second. Pete met them at the door to take the provisions, looked at both of them with the assessing comprehension of a man who has known Wyatt Granger for 9 years, and went about the business of putting things away without comment. The afternoon continued, the work continued. Down the road, in the county seat and in the marshal's office, processes were underway that moved at their own pace, that could not be hurried, that would produce whatever they produced on their own schedule. All she could do was keep the documentation current, keep the house running, keep showing up every day in this place she had not planned to be, and had nevertheless become part of, in every way that the word meant. She put supper on. The men came in. Wyatt sat at the head of the table. She sat where she always sat, and the evening moved around them. And outside the valley lay under a clear sky, wide and indifferent and full of the ordinary future. The inquiry moved the way Deering had said it would, at the speed it moved, which was not fast, and which required a particular kind of patience that Evelyn had to work at, rather than coming to naturally. 3 weeks after their visit to the marshal's office, a territorial investigator named Holt arrived in Harlan Creek without announcement and spent 4 days going through the county assessor's records. She heard about this from May, who heard it from the woman who cleaned the county office, and she did not reach out to Holt directly because Deering had not invited her to, and inserting herself into the official process before it was ready for her would have been the kind of move that felt satisfying and accomplished nothing useful. She had learned this from watching her father. She stayed at the ranch and kept the records current and let the process run. Wyatt was harder to manage in this period than she was. He was not a man built for waiting when the thing he was waiting on was the protection of something he had spent 12 years building, and she could see the cost of it in the way he moved through the days, doing the work, all of it, efficiently and without complaint, but with a tightness around him that she recognized as the physical form of held tension. She did not try to talk him out of it. She did not offer reassurance she couldn't guarantee. She stayed close and kept working and let him know through the ordinary fabric of daily life that she wasn't going anywhere. On the 4th day of Holt's investigation, Wyatt came in from the south pasture at midday, which he never did, and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Holt is at the county office right now going through files with the county clerk." She turned from the stove. "How do you know?" "Birch sent Colt out." She thought about this. "Then it's in the records. If he's going through files with the clerk rather than the assessor he's cross-referencing, he found the contradiction." She turned back to the stove. "That's good." "It doesn't feel like anything yet," Wyatt said. "It never does from the inside," she said. "That's the part nobody tells you." He came in and sat at the table, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate without talking much, and the afternoon settled around them. And she thought about her father sitting at a kitchen table in Ohio waiting for a railroad company to respond to a formal complaint that would eventually go nowhere. And she thought about how different this was. Not in the waiting, which felt the same, but in the ground they were standing on. The ground here was solid. The documentation was sound. The process was legitimate. None of those things had been true for her father, and she had known it even then. And she had watched him put his faith in a process that was working against him while he believed it was meant to work for him. She was not her father, and this was not that. Holt's inquiry produced a formal finding 6 days later. She and Wyatt received the document together, sitting at the kitchen table the same way they seemed to receive most of the significant things. Side by side in the ordinary space of the house, the lamp between them, the rest of the ranch going about its business beyond the walls. The finding was precise and official and used the measured language of a territorial investigator who understood that every word in a document like this would be read by lawyers before it was read by anyone else. It stated that the county assessor's records contained a filing, the tax lien against Granger Ranch, that had no corresponding authorized assessment in the county record and bore the authorization signature of a deputy assessor who had resigned from his position 3 months prior to the filing date, and therefore had no authority to authorize anything. It stated that the payment made by Wyatt to the individual identifying himself as county assessor, Grell, had been received by no account in the county's financial records, and that the individual presenting himself as Grell could not be identified through official county personnel records. It concluded that the filing constituted fraudulent use of county authority and recommended immediate invalidation of the lien. There was a second section, smaller, written in a slightly different register that she recognized as Deering, making a carefully chosen addition. It noted that the investigation had identified a pattern of county-level interference in the land affairs of multiple property owners in the valley, and that a separate inquiry had been opened into the activities of the county sheriff's office. Wyatt read it through twice. Then he set it down. "The lien is gone," he said. "Yes." "And the sheriff?" "The inquiry is opened. That's not the same as—" "I know." He looked at the document. "It's moving." It was moving. The arson investigation, which had been running parallel, had produced its own interim report 2 days prior. She had not told him yet because she had wanted to understand what it said before she presented it. And what it said was that the fire investigator confirmed the origin point on Aldridge's land, identified physical evidence consistent with accelerant use, and had forwarded the finding to the territorial prosecutor's office for assessment. She told him now. She'd watched his face. He was quiet for a long time after she finished, long enough that she let it sit without filling it. "He's going to know all of this is happening," Wyatt said finally. "He has people. He'll know." "Yes," she said, "he'll know." "What does he do when he knows?" She had been thinking about this. "He has 2 choices. He can fight it, hire lawyers, contest every finding, make it as expensive and slow as possible, or he can cut his losses." "Which do you think?" She considered. She had spent more time than she would admit thinking about Duncan Aldridge's psychology, not out of any feeling about him personally, which had reduced to something too small to name, but because understanding how he thought was the most useful tool available. He was calculated, Wyatt had said, and she had seen evidence of that. But he had also escalated to arson, which was not calculation. That was desperation wearing calculation's clothes. And desperate men in legal trouble made different choices than the ones they'd planned for. "I think he fights it first," she said, "and then he cuts his losses. Men like him don't accept defeat immediately. They have to spend some time and money convincing themselves they tried everything before they accept that the thing isn't going to work." She paused. "But it's going to work. The documentation is too solid. The findings are from the territorial level. He can't call in the county sheriff to make this go away because the county sheriff is now part of the problem being investigated." Wyatt nodded. He looked at the document again, and then he folded it carefully and put it with the others in the ledger, and she understood from the way he did it, methodically, like something being placed where it belongs, that something had changed in him. Not relief yet. Not quite. But the specific shift of a man who has been holding a structure together by force of will for years and has just felt the structure find its own support. They were married on a Saturday in late October, 6 weeks after the territorial findings, in the front room of Granger Ranch with Tom Birch officiating. He held a civil officiant certificate he had mentioned once and never pressed, and Pete and Colt and Amos and Dutch present, and the Halverson brothers, and James Caldwell and May from the dry goods store, who had come with her husband and brought a pie. It was not a large event. It was not designed to be a statement, though it became one anyway. The way things that are simply and honestly done sometimes acquire significance beyond their intention. She wore the green wool dress that she had thought was ruined after the fire. Dutch had found it in the pile of things she'd set aside for burning and had brought it to her without comment, and she had looked at it and discovered that the damage was at the hem and the left cuff and was repairable by someone who knew how to sew, which she did. She repaired it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, while Pete made occasional remarks about women who fixed things they should throw away, and she told him that her opinion of what was worth saving and what wasn't was not available for review, and he laughed the way he did when he was genuinely amused rather than just politely so. There was no part of the ceremony that was perfect. Birch stumbled over a line and had to start a sentence twice. Colt, standing in the back, was visibly fighting some private emotional reaction with the determined suppression of a 22-year-old who considered composure a point of personal honor and was losing the battle. Dutch shook Wyatt's hand afterward and said, "Good," in the same tone he used for all things he considered settled, and that was his speech. Wyatt beside her was steadier than she had expected him to be. She had thought he might be uncomfortable with the form of it, the public declaration, the ceremony, because he was a man who kept his internal life private, and this was the most public version of an internal thing. But he stood there and said what was required without hesitation. And when Birch was done and he looked at her, what was in his face was not performance. It was the same thing she had been watching develop in him over months. The private thing, finally out in the open where the light could reach it. She had not cried on the train platform. She had not cried at any point in the preceding months, through all of it, which she had noted in herself without pride or judgment. It was simply that she had been too busy and too focused for tears to find a foothold. She did not cry at the ceremony either. She was happy, which felt different from the versions of happy she'd had access to before. Smaller and more specific and considerably more durable. May cried, which nobody had expected, and which May herself seemed surprised by, and which Evelyn found quietly wonderful. The results of Aldridge's legal challenge, when they came, were anticlimactic in the way that actual justice often is. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a series of findings and rulings that accumulated over 4 months into an outcome that could not be reversed. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office charged 3 people: a former deputy assessor for filing fraudulent county documents, the county sheriff for malfeasance and suppression of legitimate complaints, and Duncan Aldridge himself for arson, for conspiracy to defraud through the fraudulent assessment scheme, and for criminal interference with neighboring property rights across a documented period of 3 years. Aldridge's lawyers were good and they worked hard, and the proceedings took the better part of 8 months from the initial charges to their resolution. He contested every finding. He hired a surveyor to challenge the fire's point of origin, and the territorial fire investigators' documentation held up against the challenge. He attempted to discredit the Halverson and Caldwell statements on the grounds that they were motivated by personal animus, and Birch's notarized process of collection made that argument unavailable. He attempted to argue that the fraudulent assessment was the work of the former deputy assessor acting independently, and the documentary trail connecting payments to Aldridge's private accounts made that argument unavailable as well. Evelyn read each development in the reports that Deering sent to them directly, as he had promised to do. She read them at the kitchen table, the same table, and summarized them for Wyatt and for Pete, who had appointed himself the unofficial chronicler of proceedings and maintained strong opinions about each new development. The outcome was not everything. The deputy assessor received a fine and a short sentence and was out in less than a year. The county sheriff lost his position and faced civil liability that he settled quietly. Aldridge was convicted on the arson charge and the fraud charge, and the conspiracy charge was reduced through a plea arrangement that his lawyers negotiated in the final weeks. He received a substantial fine, a period of territorial supervision, and a court-ordered injunction preventing him from acquiring additional property in the valley for a period of 10 years. He did not go to prison, or not for long, less than 6 months in the end, reduced for cooperation with the investigation into the county sheriff's activities. Wyatt read the final disposition report at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time afterward. "It's not enough," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "it's not. He burned my pasture. He stole from me. He drove Caldwell's wife away. He spent 3 years—" He stopped. His jaw worked. 6 months. 6 months in a cell, she said. His reputation in this territory is done. His expansion plans are legally blocked for a decade. The operation he built here loses the advantage it had because the sheriff who protected it is gone. She looked at him. "It's not enough. It's also not nothing." He looked at the report. He looked at her. He was angry. She could see it clearly, the real version of it, not the controlled surface, but the actual thing underneath, and she didn't try to smooth it or redirect it. He was entitled to it. The anger was true. "You sound like you've made peace with it," he said. "I've made peace with what's possible," she said carefully. "That's different from making peace with what happened." He nodded. He was quiet. After a while he said, "My father told me once that the frontier doesn't give you justice. It gives you outcomes, and you call the best ones justice and move on." He looked out the window at the yard. "I always thought that was a cynical thing to say." "And now?" "Now I think he was right and wrong at the same time. It's not justice, but it's an outcome we made happen. That's not nothing either." "No," she said, "it's not." She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the ordinary light of the kitchen, and outside the valley went about its afternoon without ceremony. The Halverson communication agreement became a formal arrangement by the following spring, which none of them had quite planned, but which grew naturally out of the habit of contact they'd established during the preceding year. 7 ranches, a shared understanding that problems seen early were manageable, where problems ignored became catastrophic, and a quarterly meeting that rotated between properties and became, over time, something that resembled a community deciding to actually be one. James Caldwell reseeded his burned pasture. His barn had burned, not his pasture, but she always thought of them together, and hired a hand for the first time in years, and came to the quarterly meetings with a directness that bore no resemblance to the hollowed-out man who had ridden up to their gate the previous autumn. Whether his wife came back she didn't know and didn't ask. Some things were nobody's business. Eric Halverson, at the second quarterly meeting, which was held at Granger Ranch and involved a quantity of food that taxed Evelyn's planning considerably, made a short and characteristically blunt speech in which he said that what had happened in the valley over the past year had demonstrated that individual operations could not survive by keeping their heads down and absorbing what was done to them, and that the only reliable protection available to people in their situation was each other. He said this without flourish and sat down, and there was a silence that was not uncomfortable but was the silence of people hearing something they had known for a long time said plainly for the first time. Wyatt beside her said nothing during this speech, but she felt him shift slightly in his chair in the way of someone who is moved by something and will not say so. The spring after their first winter as a married couple, she planted the garden in full for the first time. Not the recovering version she had nursed through the previous year, but a proper planned garden with the rows where she wanted them and the varieties chosen for what would actually thrive in this soil, in this climate. She had spent the winter reading about it with the same methodical attention she brought to account books, and the results showed in the planning. Even if the results in the ground remained to be seen, Pete told her she'd planted the carrots too close. She told him she had read extensively on the subject of carrot spacing and was confident in her decision. He said reading about carrots was not the same as growing carrots in this specific soil with this specific water, and she said she would take that under advisement, and the carrots came in thin and crowded, and she quietly adjusted the spacing the following year without mentioning it. This was, she found, the actual texture of a life built in a place. Not the dramatic moments, which were real but rare, but the accumulated ordinary ones. The arguments about carrot spacing, the mornings when the coffee was made before anyone asked for it because the routine had become shared without being discussed. The evenings when Wyatt sat with the ranch ledger and she sat with whatever she was reading and the room held both of them without effort. She had come here with nothing that was hers. She had built something that was. Not what she'd imagined when she'd answered a correspondence agency advertisement in Ohio, not the version of a new life she'd constructed in her head on the train west. Something she couldn't have imagined, which meant something real rather than invented. There was a morning in April when she was standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, the light just coming in flat and gold across the yard, and she watched Wyatt cross from the barn to the corrals with his particular unhurried stride, and Colt fell in beside him saying something she couldn't hear, and Wyatt responded and Colt laughed, and the ordinary morning of the ranch moved around them. Dutch appearing from the bunkhouse, Amos leading 2 horses from the far gate, Pete's silhouette visible through the smoke of the cook fire he maintained for the outdoor work days. And she stood there and felt something she did not try to name immediately, because naming things too quickly sometimes reduced them. She had been thinking, in those weeks, about what it meant to belong somewhere. Not in the abstract, but specifically, what the actual mechanism of it was, how it worked in practice. She had spent most of her adult life in places she lived rather than places she was from, and she had thought, in her more honest moments, that belonging was something you either had from birth or were permanently reaching for, that it was assigned rather than built. She had been wrong about that. Belonging, she understood now, was not a state you arrived in. It was something made from repeated presence, from showing up on the difficult days as well as the easy ones, from putting your hands to the work that needed doing even when you were tired, from learning the specific rhythms of a specific place and allowing them to become yours. It was made from choosing to be somewhere, again and again, until the choosing and the being were no longer separate acts. She had not chosen to arrive in Harlan Creek. She had not chosen to be rejected on a train platform. She had chosen, standing on that platform with $4.30 in her bag, to take the first honest work available rather than accept a retreat she couldn't afford in more ways than one. She had chosen to stay when Wyatt had told her she could go. She had chosen the fire break and the documentation and the territorial marshal's office and the conversation over coffee, where she said yes and meant all of it. Belonging was what those choices had built, slowly, the way anything real is built, without a clear moment when the thing wasn't and then suddenly was, but through a long, gradual process of becoming.
She drank her coffee. The morning continued. Wyatt glanced toward the house and saw her at the window and held her gaze for a moment before turning back to whatever Colt was telling him. And she felt the look the way she felt most things now. Not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something already known, already settled into the fabric of the days.
The south pasture had come back green by mid-spring, the reseeded grass finding its footing in soil that had been through fire, and was, it turned out, the better for it. The spring ran clear along the north boundary, as it always had, as it would. The fence lines held. None of it was without difficulty. None of it was finished. A life doesn't finish until it does, and then you're not around to note the completion. There would be hard seasons and bad markets, and the ordinary attrition of years in rough country. There would be mornings when the work felt like too much, and evenings when the accumulated weight of it sat heavy, and moments when she and Wyatt said the wrong thing to each other and had to find their way back. But she had stopped waiting for conditions to be right before she allowed herself to be where she was. That was the other thing she had learned, quieter than the lessons about documentation and patience and the mechanics of justice. You did not wait until everything was resolved to begin living in the life you were in. You lived in it now, with the unresolved things still present, because now was what you had, and the alternative was to be always arriving and never arrived. She had arrived, not on the train and not on the platform, and not the day she accepted the job, or the day she said yes at the kitchen table, or the day Birch finished the ceremony with his stumble and his recovery and the room around them quiet and holding. She had arrived through all of it, incrementally, the way the summer grass comes back after fire, not from some dramatic event, but from the slow daily work of root systems that survived and kept going, and eventually, without announcement, produced something green. The morning light shifted on the kitchen floor. She set down her cup and went to work.